You know, it feels really weird to admit, but I actually have a lot in common with Ted Kaczynski. Like him, I have a really unwieldy Polish surname that is alarmingly similar to his. We both got our PhDs in mathematics at a young age. We were both victims of MKUltra experiments, and, you know, like Ted, I would consider myself to be technology adverse. But unlike Ted Kaczynski, I decided not to be a domestic terrorist.
He began his reign of terror almost 18 years ago. Tonight, this former Berkeley professor is being held. But are the professor and the Unabomber one and the same? Here's Nightline's Chris Bury.
The strange story of Theodore Kaczynski begins at this house, where he grew up in the Chicago suburb of Evergreen Park. In high school, he was in the band, biology club, coin club, German club, math club.
I went and got my yearbook out, and he was there. And I remember the face, and I remember a quiet young man.
Quiet, but smart and precocious, Kaczynski earned a scholarship to Harvard, where he graduated at age 20. Only 5 years later, in 1967, Kaczynski had his PhD in math from the University of Michigan. He began a 2-year stint on the faculty at the University of California in Berkeley. Kaczynski quit in 1969. In 1972, he moved to a remote cabin in Stimple Pass, Montana, where he has lived until his apprehension.
On April 3, 1996, Theodore John Kaczynski was arrested by FBI agents at his remote cabin on the outskirts of Lincoln, Montana. Kaczynski's arrest concluded a 2-decade-long $50 million investigation, at the time the most expensive in FBI history. From 1978 to 1995, Ted Kaczynski mailed and hand-delivered 16 improvised explosive devices to a variety of targets, initially attacking universities and airlines, lending his case codename Unabomb, and the media dubbing him the Unabomber. His explosives killed 3 and injured 23 others. In the year prior to his arrest, the Washington Post obliged to Ted's ultimatum and published his manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future. The essay outlines Ted's personal philosophies and justifications for the attacks, which, at the risk of oversimplification in favor of brevity, is best expressed by his insistence that technological progress stifles true human liberty, and that the only way to rectify this warped precedent is through militant idealism and destabilizing the system via force. Ironically, it was this very manifesto that led to Kaczynski's arrest, as his brother David recognized similar themes from the essay that Ted had used in prior writings. Nearly 30 years after Ted's arrest, the Unabomber manifesto seems to have more relevance with each passing day, especially considering the suffocating ubiquity of social networks and the inordinate economic and political power of big tech. From surveillance to censorship to foreign influence to extremist incubation to just generally promoting social malaise, the internet as a social arena is in many ways kind of fucked. Kaczynski's ideas even have representation in the Gen Z meme space with things like Return to Monkey and the opening line of his manifesto, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. And that's fucking wild to me that we live in such a hopeless technocratic dystopia that people are more comfortable semi-ironically siding with a deranged primitivist murderer than pretending that everything is okay.
The Industrial Revolution and its consequences.
On the flip side, though, there is a reasonable argument to be made that our lives today are, on the whole, probably better than when we were monkey. And it's probably not a good thing that Kaczynski's hatred for leftists has been repurposed to support modern right-wing anti-tech ideology, even inspiring other terrorists like Anders Breivik. But before this video in the comment section devolves into philosophical shit-flinging, I'll point to Civis 55's video as a fair critique of the manifesto and leave it at that. What makes Ted Kaczynski's case all the more unusual, though, is that he isn't your average hermit-turned-eco-terrorist. Because before he was a hermit, Ted Kaczynski was one of the best young mathematicians in the United States. You might have heard the anecdotes. 167 IQ at the age of 10, received a scholarship to Harvard at the age of 15, received a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan at the age of 25, and shortly after became the youngest assistant professor ever appointed at UC Berkeley. His professor, George Preliminaries, said,
"It is not enough to say he was smart.
His doctoral advisor, Alan Shields, said his dissertation was
the best I ever directed.
Maxwell Reed on his committee said,
I would guess maybe 10 or 12 men in the country understood or appreciated it.
His thesis won the Sumner B. Myers Prize for the best math thesis from Michigan that year, and there's a hallway plaque in its honor to this day. Ted Kaczynski was a documented and decorated math whiz. But as innocuous as a former career in academia is compared to, becoming the most infamous domestic terrorist in American history, the media's fixation on Ted's mathematics abilities caused a lot more problems than it should have. Part of that is because mathematics has always had a PR problem, particularly in America, where mathematics is perceived as difficult and inaccessible, and those who practice it are portrayed in media as socially inept, eccentric, or worse, as mad geniuses. It's relatable to be bad at math. It's an anomaly to be good at it, and totally incomprehensible that it could be a career to some. So when in April of 1996, people found out that this guy the FBI just arrested for a multi-decade-long bombing campaign was actually a university math professor, the media would play into this divide in their coverage. The LA Times and AP News ran stories about Kaczynski's mathematics career, the Times titling their article, "Kaczynski's dissertation would leave your head spinning." Peter Rosenthal, now a professor emeritus at University of Toronto, recalled his interactions with journalists at the time, saying this:
There were also questions about the possible relations between Kaczynski's mathematics and the crimes he is suspected of committing. The tone of the questions was insinuating. Reporters were seeking even the vaguest hint that the math mind gone wrong was capable of the most dastardly and explosive deeds.
Rosenthal is kind of fucking hilarious. He had this to say as well.
Nonetheless, after the first few calls from reporters, the sense of the absurd did start to take hold of me. I toyed with a more interesting response. You said that his thesis was entitled Baire Functions. That explains it. Mathematicians have known for years that study of that particular topic tends to lead to violence.
Former Temple professor John Allen Paulos wrote an op-ed in the New York Times where, in what reads as a half-drunken musing, he suggests that perhaps mathematics made Ted Kaczynski think so abstractly that he didn't quite connect the dots that murder is a bad thing in meat space. A lot of people got mad at that one. Instead of recognizing that Ted Kaczynski retired from mathematics almost a decade before he built his first bomb, the media did what they always do in the face of senseless violence by falling back on stereotype. But Ted Kaczynski being labeled as a math genius was worse yet for a whole other set of reasons. Because for some, Ted's mathematical intellect somehow validates his ideas from industrial society and its future. Some of the same people who insist on assessing Kaczynski's manifesto independent of his violent crimes will fall into the trap of conflating his success in mathematics with proficiency in other intellectual arenas, in this case philosophy. As Ted Kaczynski's presence continues to loom over political discourse, as more and more people recognize the prescience of his manifesto, and as more charitable and tragic depictions of him arise in media, I think it's more important than ever to deconstruct and examine the myth building behind the Unabomber. One of the biggest pieces of which is that mass murderer Ted Kaczynski was also a Harvard-educated genius with apparently incomprehensible mathematical skills. For too long, these claims of Ted's intelligence have been taken for granted, claims that non-mathematicians have no way of verifying, and professional mathematicians have no reason to inspect. Ted Kaczynski's mathematics career to this point has been reduced to a PhD, an assistant professorship, and a few glowing quotes from his professors. You should find that unsatisfying. I find that unsatisfying. There's more to the story. Why did his professors call him brilliant? Why did his advisor, Alan Shields, say his thesis was the best he ever directed? How did Ted Kaczynski in his early 20s solve open problems that his professors couldn't answer? These are questions that should have been answered 20 years ago, but I will answer them today, and I will do that by reviewing the entirety of Ted Kaczynski's 1967 PhD thesis titled Baire Functions.
Hey Jerry, in the 1960s there was a young man graduated from University of Michigan. Did some brilliant work in mathematics, specifically bounded harmonic functions. Then he went on to Berkeley, was assistant professor, showed amazing potential. Then he moved to Montana and he blew the competition away.
Yeah, so who was he?
Ted Kaczynski.
The biggest hurdle we're going to encounter is the fact that if a general audience were to attempt to read through Ted Kaczynski's thesis cold, they would have no fucking idea what's going on. Even with assistance, it would be a challenge. In the 1996 LA Times article, Ted Kaczynski's professor George Preliminaries said this:
"There are some topics that are not suitable for discussion. I simply do not see a way of writing something that is readable for the intelligent layman."
Unfortunately, that's basically correct. As Preliminaries suggests, being an intelligent layman is probably not enough. Being an intelligent layman with an undergraduate maths background or higher would be preferred. However, because I think a diverse audience will be interested in this topic, against George's judgment, I'm going to do my best to present Ted's thesis to a general audience, or at least to a general audience with some calculus familiarity. The rest of this video is structured as follows. In this chapter, Chapter 2, I'll present some standard concepts from mathematical analysis that Ted routinely uses in his thesis. Chapter 3 will document the results of the thesis, what he actually proved, and how it fit into mathematics literature at the time. And Chapter 4 will be a deep dive into the proofs of the main results of his thesis. I've tried making chapters 2 and 3 as approachable as possible for the viewers. However, if at any point the mathematical concepts become difficult to follow, you can always skip to the conclusion where I give a summary mostly devoid of technical verbiage. Or feel free to stick around and That said, let's get started. The title of Ted Kaczynski's thesis is Boundary Functions. Boundary functions are an extremely niche subtopic of mathematical analysis. Analysis is a catch-all term for a lot of different things in math relating to limits, derivatives, integrals, sequences, and series. Today, there are many branches of analysis which rigorously treat different mathematical objects. For example, complex analysis, the study of functions of complex numbers, or harmonic analysis, the study of Fourier series and their generalizations. But analysis really hasn't been around for very long. Only 400 years ago in the 17th century, Newton and Leibniz were just introducing the world to infinitesimal calculus. The development of calculus revolutionized mathematics and led to some truly monumental insights, but there was a problem. Some of these ostensibly correct results had been based on insufficient justifications, an incomplete understanding of infinite quantities, and a reliance on intuitive concepts like infinitesimals rather than unassailable logic. The classic example is Euler's solution to the Basel problem. While he arrived at the correct solution for this sum of pi squared over 6, his proof assumes the validity of an infinite product representation of the sine function. It wasn't until the 1800s when mathematicians like Bolzano, Cauchy, and Weierstrass sought to establish these results on a firm, rigorous footing, introducing consistent definitions of limits, continuity, and integration. This was the true beginning of modern mathematical analysis. During this late 1800s developmental period of analysis, there's a certain flavor to the field. You might have heard famous figures like Hardy or Russell wax poetic about the beauty of mathematics, but I can't think of a less appropriate description for analysis at this time. For something more suitable, I would instead point to a quote by Poincaré.
Logique optimale mystère.
For every definition mathematicians would come up with, for every seemingly self-evident conjecture resulting from these definitions, someone would emerge with a counterexample to mock our intuition. These counterexamples, these pathological objects, are fucking nasty, bro. Continuous functions that are nowhere differentiable, functions that are nowhere continuous, functions that are continuous almost everywhere but discontinuous on a dense set, functions that have zero derivative almost everywhere but are somehow monotonically increasing, smooth functions with no power series representation, space-filling curves, fractal curves with dimension between 1 and 2, curves that are connected but not locally connected or path connected. These counterexamples became the bread and butter of analysis. The functions you might be used to, the polynomials, the uniformly converging Taylor series, those are just the tip of the iceberg. It's these goofy, tricked out monsters under the bed that you really need to worry about. Analysis isn't so much about describing the beauty of mathematics, it's about making sure the ugly shit doesn't get too ugly. And make no mistake, Ted Kaczynski's thesis is about some pretty ugly shit. Before we review the content of boundary functions, I want to talk about 3 topics from higher level maths appearing in the thesis that the intelligent layman may not be familiar with. These are cardinality, families of sets, and measure. One of the most important mathematical concepts to emerge in the late 19th century was cardinality, or a measure of the number of elements in a set. We say that two sets, A and B, have the same cardinality if we can write a bijection between them, or a function which uniquely maps elements in A to elements in B, and vice versa. Some sets have a finite number of elements, and it's trivial to determine their size just by counting the elements. Other sets have infinitely many elements, but some infinitely large sets are in some sense bigger than other infinitely large sets. This is where the concept of countability comes in. We say that the natural numbers, so 1, 2, 3, so forth, is a countable set, or countably infinite, because you can sequentially count each member of the set, even if counting the whole set would take forever. If someone handed you an element of that set, you would be able to assign that element a number on your counting list. This idea of countability can lead to some initially very counterintuitive results. Take, for example, the positive even numbers. Though the positive even numbers are a subset of the natural numbers, they have the same cardinality as the naturals because there's a bijection between the two sets, namely you just divide the even numbers by 2. So in some sense, the positive even numbers and the natural numbers are kind of the same size. The rational numbers, or the set of fractions, even though they're dense on the real line, is also a countable set because we can use this slick listing to count them. So even the rationals, somewhat surprisingly, have the same cardinality as the natural numbers. The set of real numbers, however, is an uncountable set due to the famous diagonal contradiction argument by Cantor. Suppose you could write a list of all the real numbers between 0 and 1, and we'll represent them with binary decimal expansions. Then we can construct a new number by changing the nth digit of the nth element on the list like so. This new number is a valid real number between 0 and 1, however, because of our construction, it's different from every element on our list. Therefore, there isn't a bijection from the real numbers to the natural numbers, and thus the reals are what we call uncountable. If you want a more detailed explanation on cardinality, check out Numberphile's video on infinity. I think it's pretty good. Also, read the Wikipedia article on Georg Cantor. He's one of the more fascinating individuals in the history of mathematics. I'm introducing the distinction between countable and uncountable infinity because it shows up a lot in analysis. Speaking loosely, things tend to follow the rules when you do things countably infinitely many times, but break down when you veer into uncountable territory. Let's next talk about subsets of the real line. If a subset of the real line contains real numbers as its elements, one step above that is families of subsets. A family is a set itself. Instead of its elements being real numbers, its elements are subsets of real numbers. These families can be anything we want, like families of subsets that only have positive numbers, families of subsets that are countable, whatever. There are lots and lots of these subsets of the real line. Some are very neat and orderly, others are stupid complicated. Let's say that this bubble right here contains every single subset of R. Two important families of subsets are the open intervals and the closed intervals. Open intervals are the sets of numbers between A and B, not including A and B, while closed intervals include A and B. These are basically the simplest subsets you can hope for. Open intervals are a special case of open subsets of R. A subset of R is open if every element of the subset is contained in an open interval, which itself is contained in the subset. A subset of R is closed if it's the complement of an open subset. I've drawn these two families of open and closed subsets with a small intersection. This intersection contains exactly two subsets, all of the real line and the empty subset. These open sets are important because many things can be proved about structures in the real line solely using open sets. This is the purpose of the field of study called topology. Now, while the open and closed sets are arguably the most important subsets of the real line, there are a lot of subsets we might want to describe that are neither open nor closed. Some of these are very simple, like half-open intervals, which contain one endpoint but not the other. Others are more intricate, like the subset of rationals. One way we can extend our known families of subsets is by taking unions and intersections. If X is a family of subsets, let X sigma be the family of subsets which are countable unions of sets in X, and let X delta be the family of subsets which are countable intersections of sets in X. One important family is called F sigma, or the countable intersection of closed sets. This family contains the closed sets, obviously, but also the open sets, and the half-open intervals, and the rationals like we just mentioned. However, in the grand scheme of things, even this family is well structured and kind of small. This is going to seem unmotivated at first, but we can keep extending these families by sequentially considering more countable intersections and unions. This will lead us to one of the main characters of Kaczynski's thesis, F sigma delta, or the countable intersection of F sigma sets. While this F sigma delta family might seem contrived, it turns out that this family of sets has an important property, namely for any sequence of continuous functions, the set of points this sequence converges on is necessarily an F sigma delta set. I want to quickly prove this here to both illustrate some intuition behind how these F sigma delta sets work in a proof setting, and also to hammer home the result because it provides valuable context to the results in Ted's thesis. Credit to Henno Brandsma for this proof. Let f sub n of x be a sequence of continuous functions, and let's call its set of pointwise convergence C. Then if x is in C, the sequence f sub n of x with x fixed is a Cauchy sequence in N. So for integer n, there exists an integer m such that for all k and l greater than m, we have that the absolute value of fk of x minus fl of x is less than or equal to 1 over n. The reason why we're using 1 over n with n natural and not one of these epsilon arbitrary small arguments is because we're going to need the countability so that C actually belongs in F sigma delta. Let's call the set of x that satisfy this particular fixed inequality A sub kln. It's a lot of indices. Then the convergence set C can be written as, get ready for this, intersection over integer n of union over m of intersection of k and l greater than m of these A sub kln sets. A better way to think of this is that we just take the words of the Cauchy convergence criterion and translate the universal qualifiers into intersections and the existential qualifiers into unions. So we've now described C with these unions and intersections. We've made everything in the construction countable, so that's nice. Furthermore, we can show these A sub kln sets are closed. Since each f sub n is continuous, this distance function, absolute value fk of x minus fl of x, is also continuous. And so the inverse image of the closed interval from 0 to 1 over n is closed, which is exactly one of these A sub kln sets. Furthermore, since the intersection of closed sets is closed, what we're left with is C being a countable intersection of a countable union of closed sets. Therefore, C is in F sigma delta. Keep this result in mind as we get to the content of the thesis, because it's a useful framing for what follows. One last thing I will add is that sometimes it's desirable for your family of subsets to have certain closure properties, and I mean closure not in the sense of closed sets, but closure in that certain combinations of sets are still in the family. One of these structures is a sigma algebra, defined as a family of sets which is closed under complements, countable unions, and countable intersections. If F is some family of subsets, we define sigma of F as the smallest sigma algebra containing F, often referring to this as the sigma algebra generated by F. If F itself is a sigma algebra, then sigma F is just F itself. Otherwise, you can think of sigma F as augmenting the family with more subsets so that you get these nice closure properties you want. One such sigma algebra that will arise in the thesis is the family of Borel sets, which is the sigma algebra generated by the open sets. Since countable intersections of open sets aren't necessarily open themselves, the open sets aren't a sigma algebra and you need to add more to the family to make a sigma algebra. Borel sets show up everywhere in analysis and probability especially. The last thing we need to talk about is measure theory. Usually you'd have an entire semester to talk about this, but I'm going to speedrun this bitch and extract the bits you need in a few minutes. A typical starting point for measure theory is to talk about why Riemann integration sucks. In Riemann integration, you approximate the area under a curve by adding up these progressively thinner vertical rectangles, but there are a lot of functions that you can't do that for, like the characteristic function for the rationals, since every interval, no matter how thin, has both rationals and irrationals, so there's no good answer for the height of this rectangle. Furthermore, because there's a lot of functions that aren't Riemann integrable, taking limits of these integrals becomes a problem, since the limiting functions might not even be integrable. The way around these issues is to use a new system of integration entirely, and the popular one is Lebesgue integration, where loosely speaking, instead of chopping up the domain as you do in Riemann, you instead chop up the range and add these horizontal rectangles up. However, to successfully do this, you need to have a good rigorous way to determine the size of these rectangles, and that's where measure theory comes in. A measure is a set function that more or less defines the size of a set. Formally, we define a measure mu as a function from a sigma algebra of sets to R. The only conditions we need mu to satisfy are 1. Non-negativity, that no set has a negative measure, 2. That the empty set gets measure 0, and 3. What's called sigma additivity, that if you take the measure of a countable union of disjoint sets in the sigma algebra, then that's equal to the sum of the measures of the individual sets. That's it. Because these conditions are pretty sparse, there are a lot of different measures people use for different reasons. One super simple one is the counting measure, which just counts the number of elements in a set. Another is Dirac measure, which assigns measure 1 to sets containing a designated element and measure 0 to those not containing the element. I'll also mention here that a Borel measure is any measure that is defined over the sigma algebra of Borel sets. However, the measure most important to us is Lebesgue measure on the reals. Typically, the way these things go is that you build Lebesgue measure using something called the Carthy-Adori construction. First, you define a function called an outer measure, which can be defined on any subset of the real line, not just on your specified sigma algebra. For any subset E, consider a cover of E by a countable collection of open intervals, and then add up the lengths of those intervals. We say that the outer measure of E is the smallest that we can make this quantity, which you can think of as making these open intervals hug the set E as tightly as possible. Now, this outer measure function is pretty cool. It's defined over all subsets of R, it's translation invariant, and it gives a quantity that seems logical enough as a measure of the size of a subset. However, it's not a true measure because it's not sigma additive. In fact, it's not even finitely additive. You can come up with some really peculiar disjoint sets that break down the additivity of outer measure. So to remedy this and turn outer measure into a true measure, we restrict the sets we define outer measure on. Specifically, we restrict it to sets which satisfy this equality, called the Carthy-Adori criterion. It basically says that for any subset A of R, even the really ugly ones, outer measure is preserved when you split it by your set E. It turns out that these subsets E that satisfy the Carthy-Adori criterion form a sigma algebra, and that outer measure restricted to these subsets is sigma additive. So the restriction is a genuine measure. This restriction is known as Lebesgue measure, and sets that satisfy the Carthy-Adori criterion are called Lebesgue measurable. We say a function is Lebesgue measurable if the inverse image of every open set is Lebesgue measurable in the sense of sets. From here in the measure theory program, one would bootstrap up a definition of Lebesgue integration on these measurable functions, and then prove shit about convergence and whatever the fuck else. Fortunately for us, we don't have to bother ourselves with that. Just know that Lebesgue measurable sets and functions have relevance for theories of integration. What we will need, however, is to understand these Lebesgue measurable sets in our taxonomy of subsets on R. It turns out that Borel sets satisfy the Carthy-Adori criterion and therefore are Lebesgue measurable. So if we restrict Lebesgue measure to Borel sets, we have a Borel measure. Like before, a function is Borel measurable if its inverse image of an open set is a Borel set. However, there exist Lebesgue measurable sets that are not Borel sets. Specifically, there are Lebesgue measurable sets with measure 0 that aren't Borel. For example, the Cantor middle third set, while a Borel set with measure 0 has subsets which are not Borel. This is a problem because intuitively we'd like a subset of a measure 0 set to also have measure 0. Measures that satisfy this condition are called complete measures. But with Borel measure, we have the undesirable situation where not all subsets of measure 0 sets can be associated a Borel measure. So Borel measure is incomplete. Lebesgue measure, on the other hand, is complete. It's actually what we say is the completion of Borel measure. And speaking of sets of measure 0, which we sometimes call null sets, you can think of these as being insignificant compared to subsets which have positive measure. Let's say we need a function to have a property, say continuity for example, in order to satisfy the conditions of a particular theorem. There are a lot of times when we don't actually need this property to hold on the entire domain, just on most of it, everywhere except on a set of measure 0. We refer to this as almost everywhere. So for instance, there's a theorem that says a bounded function that's continuous almost everywhere is necessarily Riemann integrable. You can take this function and goof up the continuity as much as you want. As long as you're only goofing it up on a set of measure 0, it won't change Riemann integrability. This concept of things happening almost everywhere will come up quite a bit. Also, just to be clear, almost everywhere is more general than everywhere except a countable subset, since there do exist uncountable sets of measure 0, but I'll make that distinction as it arises. The upshot of all this discussion is that there are a lot of Lebesgue measurable sets, which is great because this allows us to integrate a lot of weird shit. It is good to be aware, however, that there are some ruthlessly pathological sets that are not Lebesgue measurable. For example, a Vitali set V on the closed interval 0 to 1 defined as follows. For every real number, there is exactly one element V of big V such that V minus R is rational. So even though we can measure a lot of stuff with Lebesgue measure, we can't measure everything. Now we're ready to talk about boundary functions. Just kidding, we need to talk about some other bullshit first. This one will be quick at least. The same way we can construct this hierarchy of subsets on the real line, you might also be interested in classifying functions on the real line, from the nicely behaved to the ugly AF. One of these schemes is called Baire classification, and it's pretty intuitive. You start out by defining the functions of Baire class 0 as the continuous functions, which are nice, right? Then we define Baire class 1 functions as pointwise limits of continuous functions, which again were the Baire class 0 functions. So Baire class 1 includes things like Thomae's function, the characteristic functions of the integers, and the characteristic function of the Cantor set. Then we can proceed iteratively, defining Baire class alpha plus 1 functions as pointwise limits of Baire class alpha functions. You can even extend this to Baire class of ordinal numbers, so you could imagine a situation where you take a limit of functions where the nth function is of Baire class n. The result would be a function of Baire class omega. So somehow as you go up in Baire class, you include increasingly deviant bullshit functions. But even beyond this transfinite setting, there exist functions which are not in any Baire class at all. Like I said, the Baire classification is a good way to characterize how ugly functions get, and we'll use this classification to put a limit on how ugly Ted Kaczynski's boundary functions get. The only other thing you'll need to know about Baire functions is that they have a relationship with Borel measurable functions. Namely, every Baire class function is Borel measurable, and conversely, every Borel measurable function is Baire class for some ordinal. Oh, there's also this thing called honorary Baire class 2 that pops up a lot in his thesis. We say that a function is honorary Baire class 2 if you can change its value at a countable number of points to get back a Baire class 1 function. To be honest, I don't really know how honorary Baire class 2 stacks up with actual Baire class 2 in the hierarchy. I'm pretty sure it's properly contained, and it rarely shows up elsewhere in the literature, but in any case, you can think of both BC2 and honorary BC2 as a step more general BC1. Now we're ready to talk about boundary functions.
Excuse me.
You can get your per diem at the front desk.
No, it's not that. My question was never answered. Is it corrections or errata?
It's corrections. Why?
Come look at the format.
It's weird.
To you, it's weird. To me, these numbered paragraphs, the numbered endnotes, and the corrections page, this is a dissertation. This is standard formatting for a PhD.
I asked everyone about the formatting.
Well, that's the thing. Modern dissertations look totally different now. The word processor changed everything. This is in the style of an older graduate thesis paper. I noticed these kind of things. And this style of endnotes was only used before 1972-ish when they changed to footnotes.
The corrections page?
It was called errata before 1967.
Meaning you learned the formatting between 67 and 72.
More than that. Only PhD candidates use this style, so if he's still using this format 20 years later...
He must have written a dissertation. He must have written a dissertation between 67 and 72. Very nice.
Comparative linguistics. Not as useless as a Unabomber thinks.
Okay, we just spent a ton of effort building up some pretty technical machinery so that you can at least recognize the words of Ted Kaczynski's results, but I'd like to bring things up to a more conceptual level. The boundaries we'll talk about in boundary functions are simple and exactly what you'd expect. You have a shape, and the boundary is just the edge of the shape. Usually that shape is the upper half plane or the complex unit disk. If I had to reduce Ted Kaczynski's thesis to one sentence, it's this. Shit that happens on the inside affects what happens at the boundary. That's literally it. We're going to dress it up with the language of mathematics, but in principle, this is exactly what's going on. Maybe said with a little more decorum, functions with certain properties on the interior can only reasonably have certain properties at the boundary. Now, this relationship between interior and boundary might be familiar. In fact, you've probably seen this in a few settings in the reverse, where the function values at the boundary determine something about its behavior on the interior. If you've taken calculus, you may have seen something called mean value theorem. That is, if you have a differentiable function defined on an interval from a to b, there exists a point in that interval where the tangent of the function is parallel to the secant. Maybe you've seen intermediate value theorem, which states that a continuous function defined from a to b necessarily takes values between f of a and f of b somewhere in its domain. Or you might be familiar with results like the maximum modulus principle from complex analysis, that for any complex analytic function defined on a simply connected domain, the point at which the function attains maximum absolute value lies on the boundary. or Stokes' theorem, which relates boundary integrals to volume integrals for regions in R3. The point is that there are tons of results that relate interior behavior of functions to boundary behavior and vice versa. With all that, now I get to explain what the fuck a boundary function actually is in the context of Ted Kaczynski's thesis. Let's take a trip to the real plane and define a function f not everywhere, just in the upper half plane. So for y values strictly greater than 0, not at y equals 0, that's important. For now, we'll keep this function general and map f into a metric space y, so it could be real, complex, vector valued, whatever. So we've defined a function in the upper half plane, but specifically not on the real line, y equals 0, which is the boundary of the upper half plane. What if, hear me out, what if we wanted to extend our function to this boundary? How could we do that in a way that makes sense? Well, we could define this extension to be whatever we want, but that's probably not so satisfying. Maybe a good place to start is if our upper half plane function is continuous, we'd want its boundary to preserve continuity, right? So what if we define the value at a point x of our boundary function to be the limit of f as it approaches x? This seems appropriate enough, it lines up with our intuition nicely. However, for the ugly functions we'll be dealing with, having a two-dimensional limit defined is kind of restrictive. Also, there's some historical context for why we need a less restrictive limit definition, which I'll talk about later. To loosen things, we'll introduce the concept of curvilinear convergence, where a typical limit in R2 requires that the limiting value of f is the same no matter how x is approached. In curvilinear convergence, we just want there to exist some path gamma where the limit is defined as you travel towards x on that particular path. Now we get to define a boundary function. The boundary function phi of an upper half plane function f is defined on some subset E of the real line and maps values on E into the same metric space that f maps the upper half plane into. We say that phi is a boundary function if, for all x in E, there exists some simple arc gamma with an endpoint at x such that the limit of f along this path towards x approaches phi of x. This is the boundary function. So what now? Well, you might have noticed that in this definition, we've defined the domain of phi to be E, a subset of the real line, not the entire real line. This is because for many upper half plane functions, there are points at the boundary that don't have curvilinear convergence. Let's look at some examples of this. Take f to be 1 over x squared plus y squared. This function is continuous in the upper half plane, and every point on the boundary besides the origin has curvilinear convergence to the obvious values of 1 over x squared. However, no curve with endpoint at the origin converges. So in this case, we say that the set of curvilinear convergence is the real line minus the origin. There can also be functions where the set of curvilinear convergence is empty, like f equals 1 over y. Just because a function has a singularity, however, does not mean that its set of curvilinear convergence can't be the entire real line. Take the function f equals x times y over x squared plus y squared, for example. This function is well defined everywhere in the upper half plane, and there are well-defined two-dimensional limits on the real line everywhere except at the origin. However, at the origin, things get a little weird. A two-dimensional limit doesn't exist at this point, but we do have curvilinear convergence. Let's consider our curves to be straight lines approaching the origin, so let gamma be parameterized as a times t comma t, where a is any real number and t is positive limiting to 0. If we substitute these quantities into f, then we have a over a squared plus 1. So f is actually constant on these rays extending from the origin. And even weirder, depending on the path we take to the origin, we'll find a different limit. This example shows not only that curvilinear convergence can exist at points where strict limits aren't well defined, but that for an upper half plane function f, sometimes there can be infinitely many valid boundary functions. In this case, the boundary function vanishes everywhere except the origin, where at the origin the function can take on any value in the closed interval from -1/2 to 1/2. Just in case you think that a curvilinear convergence limit depends only on the linear angle of approach, take a look at the upper half plane function f equals y over x squared plus y. If we take our paths to be lines approaching the origin, the limit will always be 1 no matter which line is used. However, if we let gamma be a parabola with the origin at its center, then we can arrive at curvilinear limits between 0 and 1, depending on how steep the parabola is. This to say that for some functions, different kinds of paths arrive at different limits, and that's not even to consider the wacky paths that aren't polynomial. The examples we've considered all have a single point of contention, but we could consider functions with a lot of singularities, even infinitely many, such as 1 over sine of pi times x squared plus y squared. In this case, the set of curvilinear convergence is the reals minus the integers. We could even have infinitely many of these singularities in a neighborhood of the origin, such as in the function 1 over sine of pi over x squared plus y squared. Here, the set of curvilinear convergence would be the reals minus the union of the origin and the points 1 over n, where n is some positive or negative integer. Before moving on, I just want to add one more example. These boundary function examples that I've shown have all been smooth almost everywhere on the set of curvilinear convergence, but there are cases where the interior functions qualitatively differ from their boundary functions. An example that shows up a bunch in complex analysis is one of these Weierstrass functions here. F of z equals the sum over n of 1/3 to the n times e to the I times z times 3 to the n. In this case, if z is in the unit disk, f is smooth. Meanwhile, if absolute value of z equals 1 as on the boundary, then an argument from Hardy shows that the function is one of these nowhere differentiable Weierstrass functions. So differentiability is not necessarily preserved as one passes from interior to boundary. These examples were all continuous in the upper half plane. You could probably imagine that considering less regular functions could probably lead to some dicey situations on the boundary. But to summarize what we've learned from these examples, sets of curvilinear convergence can be subsets of the real line. In fact, they could be empty, or they could be kind of complicated. And boundary functions are not necessarily unique. So I asked the question after defining boundary functions. What do we even do with these? What is it that we want to show? Remember the tagline of Ted's thesis, shit on the inside affects shit at the boundary. Now we can replace shit with something more intelligent in the language of boundary functions. The real question is this: how does behavior of a function in the upper half plane affect its sets of curvilinear convergence? If f is continuous, where does its set of curvilinear convergence lie in the taxonomy of subsets of the real line? If f isn't continuous but something else, what does that mean for where we can define the boundary functions? What do the properties of f mean for the properties of its boundary functions? This is the crux of Ted Kaczynski's thesis. Before we get into exactly what Ted Kaczynski proved in his thesis, it's probably a good idea to place his results in a historical context. We'll start with this guy, Frederick Bagmill. I couldn't find a picture of him, so I'm using this. Also, I have no idea how to pronounce his last name, so I'm just going to call him Fred. Fred was a mathematician at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and was extremely active in the 50s and 60s, even holding a position at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton from 53 to 55. During this time, Fred was publishing quite a bit on analysis, and one of his interests, among many, was cluster set theory. Cluster set theory was interested in the behavior of usually complex-valued meromorphic functions on clusters of points which limit to the boundary of a domain. Perhaps that's already starting to sound familiar. In 1960, Kiyoshi Noshiro published a review book on cluster set theory, which references some results from Fred. One of these was from his 1955 paper, Curvilinear Cluster Sets of Arbitrary Functions. At this time, cluster set theory was very much rooted in complex analysis, so these guys were considering functions in the unit disk with the unit circle as its boundary. But this is equivalent to the upper half-plane formalism we talked about earlier, so don't worry about that distinction. Although Fred doesn't say the words boundary functions in his paper, he proves one of the first results on them. Remember example 3 in the previous section, where I showed a function with a peculiar singularity that harbors different limiting values depending on the one-dimensional path you approach the singularity on? In the language of curvilinear convergence, we will call these points ambiguity points, or points on the boundary which have different limit values depending on the path of approach. By adapting certain analysis ideas from earlier in the century, Fred proved that even for arbitrary functions on the disk, there is at most a countable number of ambiguity points on its boundary. So somehow, even for interior functions that behave very badly, their boundary functions can't be too crazy, in the sense that you can't define them to be whatever you want on an uncountable set. Now here is George Peranian. George was a well-known complex analyst. He taught at University of Michigan, he was friends with the famous Paul Erdos, and he was one of the first editors of the Michigan Mathematics Journal. George also had the dubious honor of being Ted Kaczynski's closest mentor in grad school. George's papers in the early part of his career dealt with complex power series and their relationship to singularities. George also wrote a paper about cluster sets with Erdos in 1960. And in 1961, Fred and George, not Weasley, published boundary functions for functions defined on a disk, which transitioned away from the language of cluster set theory in favor of a boundary function presentation like we went over previously. I get the impression it's one of the first. The paper starts by reviewing Fred's earlier results on ambiguity points, and then posits a conjecture relating functions in the disk to their boundary functions within the Baire classification. Namely, they hypothesize that if f is a disk function in Baire class Xi, its boundary function is at most Baire class Xi plus 2. So remember that as you go up in Baire class, the functions get more unruly. So this conjecture basically puts a limit on how poorly behaved these boundary functions can get. But Fred and George couldn't prove this. In the rest of the paper, they prove weaker versions of the conjecture, where they impose conditions on both disk and boundary functions, and then prove some Baire class relations. Later in the paper, Fred and George do something else though. They try proving some results in the reverse. So instead of showing that conditions on the disk function f imply something about the boundary functions it can admit, they start with a boundary function and then ask if it's possible to construct a disk function which admits the boundary function. Theorem 9 says that if the characteristic function of a subset E of the unit circle is a boundary function for some continuous disk function f, then both E and its complement must be the union of a countable set and a G delta set, G delta being a countable intersection of open sets. This is necessary and sufficient as well. So if E is of this form, then there's a continuous disk function which admits the characteristic function of E as its boundary function. But if E is not of the aforementioned form, then no continuous disk function exists with the characteristic function of E as its boundary. Theorem 10, a slightly more pessimistic result, says that there exist boundary functions of Baire class 2 which do not pass through to a continuous disk function. So if their conjecture would predict that the boundary function of a continuous disk function is at worst Baire class 2, their conjecture is not as strong as possible because Theorem 10 disproves the reverse. The last character that we're going to introduce is John Emerson Macmillan. J.E., as he went by in his papers, received his PhD from Rice University in 1964, where he wrote about, you fucking guessed it, boundary functions. I can't really find any info on this guy other than he published a few papers with Fred and George, and it looks like he taught at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the 70s and 80s with Fred. In 1966, J.E. published Boundary Properties of Functions Continuous in a Disk, where, among other results, in Theorem 5 he proved a connection between continuous functions on a disk and their sets of curvilinear convergence on the boundary. Now remember this result earlier that I claimed would be super important, that any sequence of continuous functions converges on an F sigma delta subset? Well, given that, what do you think we can say about the sets of curvilinear convergence for a continuous function on a disk? Right, they are also F sigma delta. I'm presenting these results as if the connection is immediate, but it took J.E. 4 pages to prove that the sets of curvilinear convergence for continuous functions are F sigma delta, so not at all trivial. At the end of this paper, J.E. concludes with an open question, a kind of converse to Theorem 5. He asks whether for every honorary Baire class 2 boundary function phi defined on an F sigma delta subset A, can we find a continuous disk function f with curvilinear convergence set A and boundary function phi? In other words, he proved the link from continuous disk function to F sigma delta curvilinear convergence set, but can we prove something in the other direction? This is where Ted Kaczynski enters the picture. In 1962, Ted Kaczynski enrolled in the mathematics graduate program at University of Michigan after graduating from Harvard. 2 years later, in 1964, Ted would publish his first paper, an alternate proof to Wedderburn's Little Theorem, an algebraic result saying that finite domains are necessarily fields. This would be his only contribution to the algebra literature. The remainder of his grad school output centered around boundary functions. My impression is that Ted took a course from George Peranian, potentially a measure theory course, and George pulled a Good Will Hunting, writing some open questions about boundary functions on the board. And it seems like Ted immediately took to his professor's challenge. Peranian had this to say about Ted as a student.
I mentioned it in class and Kaczynski picked up the ball and ran like hell. Hurrah, I never would have accomplished what he could. This happens every so often, that you find a student in your class who runs circles around you. I'm proud to have known him.
George had nothing but respect for Ted's mathematics abilities, even after the arrest. By all accounts, Ted was extremely diligent, quiet, and organized, harboring a zeal for his work. Peter Duran, a professor on Ted's committee, said this.
He wrote much more detail than necessary. The proofs to his theorems were much more detailed than necessary. He would deliver sheaves of handwritten, neatly written manuscript, all finished by the time he showed it to his thesis advisor. He was very impressive, and we all expected him to go on to bigger things in research.
So after me ranting about measure theory and some sigma delta bullshit for the past hour, now we finally get to appreciate these quotes and understand what the acclaim for Ted Kaczynski's math was all about. Ted wrote several papers on boundary functions during his time at Michigan, but I will focus on the results from his PhD thesis because it compiles content from his previous papers. There are two groups of results in his thesis, one on boundary functions of continuous half-plane functions, and the other on boundary functions of more general Baire-class half-plane functions. Let's talk about this first group. First, Ted gives a slightly cleaner proof to Macmillan's result, now in the half-plane, that the set of curvilinear convergence of a continuous half-plane function is necessarily F sigma delta. But he doesn't stop there, because next, Ted goes through a laborious 24-page construction to prove part of what Macmillan couldn't, that for every F sigma delta subset E of the real line, there exists a continuous half-plane function which has precisely E as its set of curvilinear convergence. There is the odd caveat that due to the specifics of the construction, this half-plane function is not real, rather complex, but as we'll see, this proof alone demonstrates the praise of a young Ted Kaczynski as a fastidious mathematician. After characterizing the sets of curvilinear convergence for continuous half-plane functions, Ted then characterizes the boundary functions as none other than honorary Baire class 2 functions, this time answering a conjecture from the 1961 paper by Fred and George. So in this first part of his thesis, Ted proved almost everything you could want to know about boundary functions for continuous half-plane functions. But Ted wasn't finished, because after his full treatment of boundary functions for continuous half-plane functions, he moved up the Baire classification ladder. Now remember Fred and George's conjecture that the boundary function of a Baire class Xi disk function was Baire class no more than Xi plus 2? Well, Ted proved something even stronger, that the boundary functions are actually Baire class Xi plus 1, so 1 degree more well-behaved than Fred and George had thought. And since Borel measurable functions are Baire class, it immediately follows that Borel measurable half-plane functions admit Borel measurable boundary functions. Okay, just jumping in here to add some additional context. I fear that the way I just presented this makes it seem like Ted unilaterally improved on Fred and George's conjecture, which he did, but this result is only part of it. Fred and George's conjecture attempts to place a bound on the Baire class of boundary functions for disk functions of all Baire classes. And based on what they knew at the time, this bound of Xi plus 2 really isn't that bad of a guess, since they proved the existence of continuous, i.e. Baire class 0, disk functions admitting boundary functions strictly in BC2 outside of BC1, and they hadn't really attacked results for higher Baire class disk functions yet. What Ted contributed was instead of handling all Baire class half-plane functions with a single result, he separated the continuous functions from the functions of Baire class Xi greater than or equal to 1. So for these higher Baire class functions, Ted proved the tight bound on the boundary functions as being in BC Xi plus 1, while for continuous half-plane functions, we just mentioned that Ted proved those boundary functions are in honorary BC2. Because I was a little loose with my language, I just wanted to make the clarification here that the Xi plus 1 result doesn't hold for continuous half-plane functions, and we'll talk about this discrepancy in more detail later. Now up to this point, there's been a certain theme to the results in Ted Kaczynski's thesis, that for these half-plane functions, there's a kind of limit to how nasty their boundary functions can get, and that limit ends up being rather tight. So for the continuous half-plane functions, their boundary functions are honorary Baire class 2. For Baire class half-plane functions, those corresponding boundary functions are at most one rung up the Baire classification ladder, and the motion from half-plane to boundary function preserves Borel measurability. Unfortunately, this is just about where our luck runs out, because Ted's last result demonstrates that for Lebesgue measurable half-plane functions, we don't necessarily get back Lebesgue measurable boundary functions. They could be really pathological non-measurable functions instead. These are the results from Ted Kaczynski's PhD thesis. If I had to summarize, Ted proved that boundary functions are only slightly nastier than their corresponding interior functions. And in certain settings, you can actually construct well-behaved interior functions from a given boundary function. As mentioned, Ted's thesis won the Sumner B. Myers Prize for Michigan's Best Mathematics Thesis in 1967, and to this day there's still a hallway plaque in its honor. Also, he won $100. So why was his thesis so special? To be honest, I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that. I haven't read all the other theses from that year, and I haven't dived this deep into measure theory since grad school. I think in cases like this, it's best to defer to the experts, principally George Baranian, especially since he probably saw Ted weekly and had an understanding of his mental process. Based on his comments, I think George was genuinely ecstatic that a student was able to come in and close the book on some of his own unanswered questions in the field. Revisiting Fred and George's 1961 paper, you get the sense that they don't have the big picture quite yet. Their results beat around the bush or come with extra conditions to make everything work. For example, their Theorem 7, which draws the conclusion that for continuous disk functions, the boundary functions are honorary Baire class 2 if you add the assumption that the boundary functions admit mutually disjoint arcs. Or Theorem 8, which proves that honorary Baire class 2 functions are boundary functions for some continuous disk function, but leaves open the possibility that functions outside honorary BC2 could also be boundary functions for these continuous disk functions. Ted's thesis ties up all of these loose ends, but more importantly builds a cohesive narrative about boundary functions in a way that prior papers only hinted at. So that's it. We've been building all of this background up just to understand what Ted Kaczynski proved in his PhD thesis. Now we're going to see how he did it.
Have you seen Brian Kelly? No, I haven't. He's right over there. Brian, come here.
Lead the way,
Come here.
Brian. Oh, what's that for?
You have 10 minutes, Ted. Fellas, thanks again for letting me come to this. A class reunion doesn't happen very often. And I tell you, it feels like I never left.
Oh my God, don't tell me. Don't tell me.
No peeking.
Ted Kaczynski. Where did they find you?
Jimmy Mallory, you old bull shark, how the hell are you?
Not bad. So, what have you been up to?
I've been doing a lot of writing.
Yeah, really? You get anything published?
Yeah, one thing. Yeah.
So, where you been living now?
I got this great little place up in the woods. It's real secluded and gives me a lot of times to tinker around with my hobbies.
Oh, I remember your hobbies.
Hey, cut it out! You son of a... Hey, can I introduce Stu and Mike here for you?
In this chapter, I'm going to review the proofs of the results in Ted Kaczynski's PhD thesis. I won't check every single detail. If you're interested in a full treatment, you're better off just reading the full thesis yourself, which I've linked in the description. Instead, I'll follow the main beats of his arguments, so you can get a feel for the flavor of how you might prove things about these boundary functions. Fair warning to those of you who have stuck around to this point, what follows is going to be challenging to digest even for the quote intelligent layman. If you don't have formal mathematics training, a lot of the nuance in these arguments is going to fly right over your head. If it seems like I'm starting to speak another language, feel free to skip to the end. Otherwise, let's get to work. I'm going to outline the proofs of the 5 main results from Ted Kaczynski's thesis. As we just discussed, these results are as follows. 1. The sets of curvilinear convergence for continuous half-plane functions are F sigma delta. 2. Every F sigma delta set is the set of curvilinear convergence for some complex valued continuous half-plane function. 3. Phi is the boundary function of some continuous half-plane function if and only if phi is honorary Baire class 2. 4. The boundary function of a Baire class Xi half-plane function is at most Baire class Xi plus 1. And 5. The existence of a non-measurable boundary function of a Lebesgue measurable half-plane function. Personally, I like to think about really intricate proofs as pyramids, dividing up each step into digestible chunks. To me, it helps lay out the narrative of how the many lemmas and propositions fit together in a paper. At the top of the pyramid, you have the main result you're trying to prove, right? To achieve that main result, you might need 3 or 4 key results which would occupy a level below. For each of those, you might need 2 or 3 other results, and you can keep branching out after that, with the bottom of the pyramid populated by things you may as well assume as fact. Now, every mathematician has a certain presentation style. Some like to start from the top and work down. Ted Kaczynski works from the bottom up. When you're going bottom up, it helps to once in a while contextualize how the minor results at the bottom of the pyramid fit into the main result at the top. Unfortunately, Ted does not do this, and much of his thesis, especially the long construction in the middle, reads as a bunch of non sequitur proofs leading into a punchline you didn't see coming. It's a bit like Shutter Island, where you can only truly appreciate the movie on the rewatch. You definitely need to reread his thesis a few times to get a handle of how the results fit together. Since a sequential retelling of his thesis would make for a shitty YouTube video, I'm going to attempt to go top-down on the pyramid for most of these, and instead of exhaustively proving every detail, I'll judiciously stop whenever there's a result that would take too much effort to explain or doesn't meaningfully add to the narrative. Let's begin. For his first result, Ted proves that for every continuous half-plane function mapping into a complete separable metric space, its set of curvilinear convergence is in F sigma delta. Recall that this was first proved by J.E. McMillan in 1966, however, we're going to find Ted's proof to be more expedient. The general flow of the proof will be as follows. Let C be the set of curvilinear convergence for a continuous half-plane function f. We're going to be able to construct a special set B where for each point little b in big B, we can manually describe a path in the half-plane on which f converges. Therefore, B is a subset of C. And further, by the separability of f, we can then prove that B itself is F sigma delta. Then, we show that the set C minus B of points of curvilinear convergence that we couldn't ascribe this manual path to is countable, aka small. So now C is a union of B, an F sigma delta set, and C minus B, a countable set. Then routine argument shows that this union is also in F sigma delta, which gives us the result. Now we have to fill in the details. We have 4 items on our menu. 1. Construct B. 2. Prove that B is a subset of C. 3. Prove that B is in F sigma delta. And lastly, 4. Prove that C minus B is countable. Okay, so first let's construct B. Now remember, we want B to be the subset of the x-axis where we can easily construct paths of curvilinear convergence. So in this construction, we're going to want our paths in the half-plane to converge to points on B, and on those paths, we want the function f to converge to some quantity in the range space. When you hear convergence, you should think small open sets. So what we want to do is cover both the half-plane and the range of f with arbitrarily small open sets. But because we're going to need B to be in F sigma delta, we need these covers to be countable. First, let's cover the half-plane. We're going to end up using these sets to build paths converging to the x-axis. So let the set QNM be a square of length 1 over n with bottom left corner at the mth rational number on our countable list of rationals. As n increases, these squares hug the x-axis tighter and tighter, and since the rationals are dense in the real line, we get this collection of arbitrarily small squares everywhere we need on top of the real line. And more importantly, because we used 1 over n instead of epsilon, this collection of q squares is countable. We'll do something similar for the range of f. Since we have the condition that the range is separable, by definition, that means there exists a countable dense subset, which we index as P sub k. Because the range is a metric space, let's gather the collection of spheres of radius 1 over 2 to the n, centered at each of the P sub k. Like in the half-plane, now we have a countable collection of arbitrarily small balls virtually everywhere in the range of f. Then, because we want this simultaneous convergence of paths to the x-axis and the function on the path to some point in the range, we're going to construct a new open cover on the half-plane that gives us both of these, and we do this by intersection. So let's consider the pairwise intersection of every QNM set intersected with the inverse image of every sphere in the open cover of the range. And these inverse images we know are open because f is continuous. Even though the QNM sets are well behaved, right, they're fucking squares, the inverse images of the spheres might not be. They could be a little goofy, like this. But the nice thing is that each one of these intersections has a countable number of components. Well, at least Ted says they do, and he doesn't give justification, so I assume he's right. Now we get to describe this new open cover of the half-plane indexed by 4 variables now. We'll label these sets as U of N, M, K, and L. M refers to the location of the mth rational on the x-axis, which you can think of as where the paths converge to. K refers to the kth element of the countable dense subset in the range of f, so this is like where the output of f converges to. L, we say, is a counting of each component of these pairwise intersections, and finally, N controls how small these sets get. So these U sets give us this open cover of the half-plane, which will lead to nice convergence properties of the path and of the function on the path. And once again, because the indices are countable, we have a countable collection of these U sets. Now we get to define this subset B on the x-axis. And rather than explain it first, I'm just going to show it on screen. Here it is. These sets right here probably look a little weird, seeing as I didn't define what this I function or what this ACC function is. We're going to call these interval sets. You can think of these sets more or less as describing where the U sets touch the x-axis. The reason why we're working with these weird looking interval sets is because Ted proves in Lemma 8 that if two domains on the half plane, omega 1 and omega 2, have interval sets with non-trivial intersection, then omega 1 and omega 2 themselves have non-trivial intersection in the half plane. And so this is what happens. If we pick little b in big B, then since we intersected a bunch of these interval sets to build B, then for every n we can pick one of these interval sets in the intersection that contains B. And because B is in all of these intervals, we can sequentially apply Lemma 8 to pick a sequence of points Zn in the half plane, each of which belongs in the intersection of a U sub n and a U sub n plus 1 set. This way, we can connect the Z sub n by piecewise arcs contained in the U sets, the composition of which is an arc gamma. By the construction of the U sets, as n increases, the sequence Z sub n increases to B since they lie in smaller and smaller UN sets that hug B tighter and tighter. Moreover, the sequence F of Z sub n is a Cauchy sequence in Y, since the U sets are made up of intersections with the small spheres in Y. And since Y is complete, F of Z sub n converges to an actual value P. Therefore, the path gamma has these convergence properties as well, and thus little b is in the set of curvilinear convergence. So big B is a subset of C. Also, because we set everything up with countability, there are pretty straightforward set theory arguments to show that B is in F sigma delta. The last thing I'm going to show is that C minus B is countable. I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically the only other possible points of curvilinear convergence not in B are given by the boundaries of those interval sets. And since the interval sets are either open, half open, or closed intervals on the real line, the boundaries of these sets have at most 2 points. And since we are doing countably many set operations, this difference C minus B has at most countably many points. Now we're done. In the grand scheme of things, this proof is not very remarkable. The kinds of things Ted does here is really standard analysis fare. It's honestly not too dissimilar from the earlier proof that sequences of continuous functions converge on F sigma delta sets. Except here, you need to do some extra work to account for this notion of curvilinear convergence. The difficult part really is what I skipped over, proving the properties of the reals in the interval sets to ensure that we can pick our path gamma. As I said before, J.E. Macmillan published a similar proof the year prior. I think these two proofs were independently achieved. In glancing at Macmillan's paper, it looks like Ted follows the same beats of constructing B, proving C minus B is countable. Aside from Macmillan working with continuous disk functions, I think the big difference is that Macmillan details an argument that these intersection sets have a countable number of components, something that Ted glosses over, but functionally these proofs are the same. One thing that you might be wondering is if we can extend this proof. So like instead of using half-plane functions, can we prove that curvilinear convergence sets for continuous functions in arbitrary Jordan domains in R2 are necessarily F sigma delta? Can we do something similar for continuous functions in higher dimensions or even more general metric spaces? Unfortunately, Ted would prove 2 years later in 1969 that this kind of thing doesn't work in 3 dimensions, that there's a continuous upper sector function with a curvilinear convergence set lying outside of F sigma delta, so we're kind of SOL there. Alright, this is it. This is the 20-page construction that really differentiates Ted Kaczynski's thesis from the boundary function literature that came before. In the last section, I referred to building that set big B as a construction, I guess in the same sense that putting two Duplo blocks together is a construction. Constructing a continuous function from an F sigma delta set is more like building that Lego replica of the Empire State Building. Even Ted admits, quote, "Unfortunately, the proof is quite long. I won't pour through all the details, but I'll give you the general idea." We're trying to prove that for every F sigma delta subset of the x-axis, called the set A, there exists a continuous half-plane function f whose set of curvilinear convergence is precisely A and nowhere else. Now what Ted does is construct a different magic function g, and then transforms g into f. This continuous function g has a nice property, namely g converges to 0 along some arc gamma with an endpoint x on the x-axis if and only if x is in our F sigma delta set A. So this is good. G converges to 0 on arcs everywhere in A. However, this leaves open the possibility that G could have arcwise convergence to some non-zero value outside of A. So A is a subset of the set of curvilinear convergence of G. What we'd like is to have some way to transform G where we keep the convergence on A but suppress convergence outside of A, maybe by multiplying G by some wacky function. Ted's solution to this was to use a peculiar transformation, defining f as g times 1 plus I times sine of 1 over y. So now f is a complex valued function, but don't get confused because this has nothing to do with the analytic functions of complex analysis. We just as easily could have made this a vector valued function. Let's talk about this thing first, sine of 1 over y, rather sine 1 over x. Sine 1 over x is known as the topologist's sine curve. It has the bizarre property that the union of this graph with the origin is a connected set, but not path connected, as you can't draw a path contained in the graph from the origin to any other point on the curve. For us, the topologist sine curve is useful because it's bounded and continuous, but it's so wiggly that it doesn't converge as x approaches 0. This is what will help us suppress convergence outside of A. The proof is pretty simple from here. F clearly has curvilinear convergence to 0 on A, since G converges to 0 on this set. So again, A is a subset of the curvilinear convergence set of F. We now need to prove the reverse, that F has curvilinear convergence only on A, or that C is a subset of A. Suppose F converges on an arc gamma approaching an arbitrary point x, and let's say that it converges to some complex value C plus I times D. Then this means that G must converge to C. However, if C is non-zero, then the quantity G times sine of 1 over y cannot possibly converge to any value on the arc. This means that C has to be 0, and because G converges to 0 only in points on A, this means that F has curvilinear convergence only on A, which is exactly what we wanted to show. My first impression when I saw this, to be honest, was that it seemed a little sloppy, and Ted seemed to think so as well. That he couldn't construct a real valued function and needed to rely on the extra variables of a vector valued function to complete the proof. One thing you might ask yourself, or at least I asked myself, is how come you can't just make f the real valued function g times sine of 1 over y? Well, in this case, the sine of 1 over y component preserves convergence to 0 on A, and it wipes away convergence to non-zero values outside A because it's so wiggly. But the weird thing is that it has the potential to introduce points of curvilinear convergence in F that don't exist in G, which seems bizarre, right? Like, how could multiplying any non-limiting continuous function by the topologist sine curve lead to convergence? Well, you could get it by making G something that's big when sine of 1 over y is close to 0 and really small everywhere else. For example, like this function. This clearly does not converge at 0 because in any neighborhood about 0 there are infinitely many of these peaks. However, these peaks keep getting skinnier and skinnier, so that when you multiply it by sine of 1 over y, you essentially zero out the peaks and you're left with a converging function. So some crazy shit like that could trip you up if you don't go vector valued. Still, I have the feeling that a real valued construction of f is possible, and I think Ted did as well since he left it an open question at the end of his thesis. Regardless, we still have to make this magic function g, which we said has curvilinear convergence to 0 if and only if x is in A. This will take some time, but fortunately I don't have to prove shit because I'm a YouTuber, so I'll hand wave my way through most of this. I think this proof more than any benefits from a visual intuition, which is unfortunately absent from Ted's tedious textual proof, although maybe that's too much to ask from someone who's armed with only a typewriter. So let's talk about what we might want G to look like for a few different example A sets. We'll start with a simple one. Let's take A to be the closed interval from 0 to 1. This is easy enough. Just set G to be 0 when x is in this closed interval, and then have it be some non-zero continuous extension outside. The reason why this example is nice is because A is a closed set that by definition contains all of its limit points, most importantly the endpoints. So when you construct an arc that ends at 1 on the x-axis, for example, by continuity of G as an extended function of the whole plane, values in the half plane very close to the point 1, 0 themselves will be very close to 0. Here's where things get tricky. What if A doesn't contain all of its limit points? What if A, for example, is the half-open interval from 0 to 1 with 0 included and 1 excluded? A is an F sigma set, and by extension an F sigma delta set. Here, you need G to have curvilinear convergence to 0 everywhere to the left of 1, 0, even arbitrarily close to 1, 0, but at this point, you need something else. It seems incredibly counterintuitive that this could be possible, especially when considering that G needs to be continuous in the upper half plane. G would have to be weird as shit for this to happen. So that's what Ted does. He makes his function G weird as shit. This is the picture I want you to have when we finally get to the proof. Imagine this half-plane function to be equal to 1 everywhere except inside these bubbles on the half interval, where paths inside the bubbles converge to 0 on arcs approaching the x-axis. We're going to squeeze infinitely many of these bubbles on the interval and have them limit to the open endpoint at 1, 0. And these bubbles will get smaller and smaller as we squeeze them in towards 1, 0. Now, I've drawn this very crudely in a way that makes the function look discontinuous, but you could imagine gradients between these regions, with the gradients becoming sharper as you approach the x-axis. The important thing is that if you draw an arc from one bubble to the next, even if it's arbitrarily close to the x-axis, you're always passing through a region where G takes on the value 1. And now you might start to understand why this function G has curvilinear convergence to 0 on the half-open interval from 0 to 1. This function on a path to the x-axis only converges to 0 if the last part of its arc lies completely in one of the bubbles. So if you drew a path with endpoint at 1, 0, the function either converges to 1 or passes through infinitely many of these bubbles, which means it hits the value 1 infinitely many times, so definitely isn't converging to 0. A similar limiting structure also helps us when we deal with other more complicated sets. Suppose we chose A to be the set of rationals between 0 and 1. Since the singletons are closed and the rationals are countable, A is certainly F sigma, and by extension F sigma delta. However, like the previous example, A does not contain all of its limit points, so we have to be clever in how we construct G. Instead of using the bubbles from the previous example, Ted uses these upside down triangles, where inside the triangles G approaches 0 at the bottom vertex, and outside the triangle G is 1. So the picture for G in this case is to put the bottom vertex of an upside down triangle at every rational number and shrink the triangles as the denominator gets large. And of course we can turn this picture into a continuous function, but the important thing is that G only converges to 0 on paths whose terminal segments lie entirely in one of these triangles. Therefore, any path ending at an irrational number will have to take on the value 1 infinitely many times. These examples don't totally account for the weirdest sets in F sigma delta, but it should give you a visual idea where Ted is taking us in his construction. Now we get to work. Ted builds up a bunch of machinery that all comes together in the final proof. Instead of starting from our F sigma delta set A, we're going to be talking a lot about F sigma sets first. Let's call an F sigma set A. Ted defines a special family, loosely speaking a collection of disjoint or adjacent closed-bounded sets that union to A. So if A is closed, this isn't very exciting, you can just use A. But for this half-open interval, for instance, this might be a special family. He takes a lot of space to prove some things about these special families. For example, that they exist for any F sigma set. These proofs are really tedious, but he strangely shows some personality in them. In his proof that the intersection of two special families is also a special family, he uses this diagonal argument where he needs two indices to follow the diagonals of a two-dimensional lattice. And there's this really strange moment where Ted gives a closed form representation for this index function, suggesting in a footnote that the reader might find it fun to derive. He doesn't need to do this, he just takes the opportunity to style on the reader. But for what it's worth, I hadn't seen these formulas before, I thought they were kind of cool. At this point, Ted introduces the building blocks of his construction, the Lego bricks if you will. And it's really two main ones. You have the upside down triangles, and also these trapezoids with triangle cutouts. These are kind of like the bubbles I was referring to earlier. Both of these shapes are open, by the way. He then describes special functions for the special families, which basically give instructions for how to stack his building blocks on top of the F sigma set. The rules are that the trapezoids go on top of non-degenerate closed sets of the special family, with the triangle cutouts over complementary intervals, kind of like this. The upside down triangles go on top of points of the special family sets. All the shapes have to be disjoint, and if you have infinitely many of them, their heights must limit to 0. Actually proving that special functions exist for special families can take a while, but already you can see how this kind of fits into the picture I drew. After all of this setup, here's where the proof begins in earnest. Let A be your F sigma delta set. Then A can be written as the countable intersection of F sigma sets, called these A sub n. Moreover, we can arrange these to be nested such that each A sub n is contained in the previous set A sub n minus 1. Each A sub n admits a special family because it's F sigma. We can sequentially intersect these families as we increase n, constructing new collections of special families to ensure sets in our new special family for a sub n plus 1 are contained in the special family sets for a sub n. Then, for each a sub n, we write special functions such that as n increases, the interior angles of the trapezoids decrease to pi over 8, the exterior angles of the triangles increase to 3 pi over 8, and the heights of the shapes get smaller and smaller. And now for each n, we construct an open set u sub n. Each u sub n is the union of all the triangles and trapezoids from the nth layer. So check this out. Each u sub n contains a disjoint collection of these trapezoids and triangles that close in on A on the x-axis, which will be useful for proving convergence stuff. And critically, we have not only that u sub n plus 1 is contained in u sub n, but the closure of u sub n plus 1 is contained in u sub n. Otherwise stated, none of the limit points of u sub n plus 1 are also limit points of u sub n. This means we get to use something called Uri-san's lemma. Uri-san's lemma says that on a normal topological space, which R2 is thankfully, you can separate two closed sets by a continuous function. This is where we really get to construct G. Using Uri-san's lemma, let G sub n be a function taking value 0 on the closure of u sub n plus 1, 1 on the complement of u sub n, which is a closed set since u is open, and then some continuous interpolation between. Now we have a collection of these continuous G sub n functions, and adding them up with some exponential scaling gives us our desired function G. QED, motherfucker. Of course, you got to check continuity and that satisfies all the properties we want, but it does, bro. Just trust me. In my opinion, this is honestly a pretty impressive result, especially considering how much of a departure it is from the previous literature. Ted's intuition behind creating these strange half-plane functions is pretty slick if he came up with that on his own. What also could be possible is that he adapted some kind of proof for sequences of continuous functions. I'm imagining an analogous construction where, starting with an F sigma delta set, one writes a sequence of continuous functions that pointwise converge precisely on the set and nowhere else. Even in that case, standing on the shoulders of giants and being perceptive enough to port results to different domains demonstrates just as much skill. But I think more than anything, Ted's patience to wade through the minutia of those special family and special function proofs is a fucking talent. Checking all of the different conditions and cases that show up in those proofs is first of all boring as fuck, but just a lot to keep track of. If I read into the quotes from George Perinian and the rest of Ted's thesis committee, I would bet that this is the result they were most impressed by. In these first two results, we really only commented on the structure of the curvilinear convergence set for continuous half-plane functions, namely that it's F sigma delta. Ted hasn't yet said anything about the boundary function itself, like where on the Baire hierarchy it might lie. Well, in these next few theorems, Ted starts to answer some of those questions. The major result of this section that Ted proves is as follows. A function phi on a subset E of the x-axis is a boundary function for a continuous half-plane function if and only if phi is honorary Baire class 2. That means we have two things to prove. First, if phi is a boundary function for continuous f, then it's honorary Baire class 2. And second, if phi is honorary Baire class 2, then it is a boundary function for some continuous f in the half-plane. Now I do want to clarify that we have not asserted that E is precisely the set of curvilinear convergence for f as in the previous proof. In fact, it will probably only be a subset of the true set of curvilinear convergence. Phi still acts as a boundary function on these restrictions. This won't change much in the forward direction. However, in the reverse, where we construct a continuous half-plane function f from an honorary BC2 boundary function phi, we will not be so strict in our construction as to ensure f has curvilinear convergence only on the subset E on which phi was defined. So let's get to work, first in the forward direction. The details in this set of proofs are not particularly enlightening, so I'll breeze through this section. We want to show that if f is a continuous half-plane function and phi is an associated boundary function defined on some subset E of the real line, then phi must be honorary Baire class 2. And recall that a function is honorary Baire class 2 if you can change its value on a countable collection of points to turn it into a Baire class 1 function. What Ted does here is to prove a different strange-looking property of phi, which will then imply that phi is honorary BC2. In the introduction of his thesis, Ted proves a variety of results about Baire functions. One of these is Theorem 2, which states that a function phi on the real line is honorary BC2 if and only if the restriction of phi off of some countable subset is class F sigma, or in other words, if the inverse image of every open set in the range of phi is F sigma in the restricted domain. Jumping ahead to lemma 15, Ted then converts this F sigma class property to a different property, which I'm calling the sandwich property. He shows that if, for every open set in the range of phi, you can sandwich an F sigma set L between the inverse image of U and the inverse image of the closure of U plus a countable set, then phi is F sigma class off a countable subset. Again, these proofs are pretty boring, so I'm omitting them. Instead of proving directly that boundary functions of continuous half-plane functions are honorary Baire class 2, Ted will instead prove that they hold the sandwich property, which implies that they're F sigma class of a countable subset, which then implies that they're honorary BC2 like we want. To show that the boundary function satisfies this sandwich property, for every open set U in the range, we need to construct both an F sigma set and a countable set on the x-axis that give us the sandwich property. Ted starts out the proof by defining a collection of E sub n sets and a set K. E sub n is a set on the x-axis with the property that for all x in E sub n, you can draw a simple curve from the line y equals 1 over n to the point x such that the curve maps to the open set U by the continuous half-plane function f. K is also a set on the x-axis with a similar property that for all x in k, you can draw an arc ending on k which maps to the exterior of U, the complement of its closure. You might think of the E sub n sets as these kind of general arcwise inverses of U, and k as like an inverse of the exterior. And indeed, the inverse image of U by phi lies in the union of these E sub n sets, and the inverse image of the exterior of U by phi is in k. The first part of Ted's proof concludes that the intersection of k with the closure of a single E sub n is countable, this using standard topological arguments. Then that means the union of all of the intersections of k with the closures of E sub n is countable. And this set, which we label n, is our countable set that goes into the sandwich argument. And it turns out that the F sigma set that we need is the union of all of the closures of E sub n. A simple set theoretic arguments then confirm the result. So that was the forward direction. Now we have to prove the reverse, that given an honorary Baire class 2 function phi defined on a subset E of the real line, there exists a continuous half-plane function f which has phi as its boundary function. For this, Ted adapts an argument laid out by Fred and George in their 1961 paper. While Ted takes a more laborious approach than his... Fortunately for us, the present construction is much shorter and easier to wrap our heads around than the one from the previous section. One nuance I should mention about this proof is that it assumes f and phi map into Euclidean space, not a general metric space as we've been working with previously. This is because certain results about Baire class functions only work in Euclidean space. A good place to start is by defining a Baire class 1 function psi on E which agrees with phi everywhere except at a countable number of points, as phi is honorary Baire class 2. Now because psi is BC1 on E, we could say that there exists a sequence of continuous functions with domain E that converge to psi. However, because we'd like to exploit this sequence to build our half-plane function defined in the whole half-plane, we need something better. Fortunately, Ted proved something for us in lemma 6 of the introduction. For a BC1 function defined on a subset of a metric space, there exists a sequence of continuous functions defined on the whole space, which pointwise converge to the BC1 function on the subset. So using this, let G sub n be a sequence of continuous functions defined on the whole real line, which pointwise converge to psi on E. Now, if we wanted to construct a half-plane function f sub 0 having psi as its boundary function, this would be super easy. Just place members of the G sub n sequence on horizontal lines limiting to the x-axis, then interpolate between them. In this case, the curvilinear convergence would just be the vertical lines approaching the x-axis. This f sub 0 function is a good start, but remember, we want a half-plane function with phi as its boundary, not psi. So essentially what we're going to do is adjust f sub 0 so that it has curvilinear convergence not only where phi agrees with psi, but also at the countable number of points where it doesn't. This is a part of the proof that, again, much like the previous section, probably could have benefited from geometric intuition. There's a lot going on in this part of the proof, but again, because I'm a YouTuber, I can do whatever the fuck I want. So here's the gist of it. Let n be the countable set on which phi and psi disagree, the points of which we label s sub n. We're going to construct a sequence of functions associated with these points, the functions we label delta sub n. These delta functions you can imagine being like upside down triangles that close in on the s sub n. We say that delta sub n is 0 everywhere except in this triangle with height 1 over n. Inside the triangle, delta sub n approaches phi of S sub n minus psi of S sub n as we move toward the vertex, such that all of delta sub n is continuous, of course. So the triangles get smaller as n increases, and you can think of them kind of like the triangles from the special families, so that as y approaches 0, you get more and more of these triangles accumulating on n. Now it's not exactly that simple. There's a bit of nuance in how Ted builds and angles these triangles, but the labor he puts into the construction is off at the end because it becomes really easy to prove curvilinear convergence to phi, as the only curves Ted needs to deal with are certain lines in the half-plane. Now, with this direction of the proof, there was one subtlety that we made note of, and that was that our boundary and half-plane functions were mapping into Euclidean space, not a general metric space. In the original 1961 paper, Fred and George made the unsubstantiated claim that things work fine for functions on the Riemann sphere as well. Ted proves this claim in a few simple steps, basically constructing a continuous half-plane function mapping to R3, then projecting that onto the sphere in a specific way. Recapping this section, Ted proved a characterization of boundary functions of continuous half-plane functions as being in honorary Baire class 2. While the proofs are not so exciting, the results are no less critical. Remember, Fred and George only proved that in order for phi to be a boundary function of continuous disk function f, it was sufficient for phi to be honorary BC2. In other words, they constructed the continuous disk function given an honorary BC2 boundary function. What Fred and George were missing was the necessity, or that every continuous disk function has an honorary Baire class 2 boundary function. This is what Ted proved in the first part of this section. It is interesting, though, to compare Ted's construction of the continuous half-plane function with Fred and George's continuous disk function, where Ted gave an extremely precise description of the upside-down triangles closing in on the countable set so that he could give a similarly exact form of the arcs that converge to the boundary function. Fred and George just relied on the existence of disjoint circles, which in some sense cover the countable set, and they were fine. In the previous 3 sections, Ted analyzed boundary functions in the setting of continuous half-plane functions. Now we're going to go up the Baire classification ladder to discuss more general Baire class half-plane functions. Here, the picture is a little less clear. First, Ted notes that we don't have any understanding of the sets of curvilinear convergence. For example, whether the set of curvilinear convergence of a Borel measurable function is also Borel measurable. Instead, Ted proves a single result that mirrors one from the previous section. Recall that he previously showed that continuous half-plane functions admit honorary Baire class 2 boundary functions. Here, Ted will show something more general, that for psi grade 1, Baire class psi half-plane functions admit Baire class psi plus 1 boundary functions, and by extension, Borel measurable half-plane functions admit Borel measurable boundary functions. As we'll see, the proofs are similar. Before we start, we will need to do some pre-work. Immediately preceding his proof of the theorem, Ted proves 5 technical lemmas, which give some indication of how much more material we'll need. First of all, let's revisit our taxonomy of families of sets on the real line. Remember, we talked about sigma and delta families of sets, where we take countable unions and intersections of family sets respectively. Now, we're going to consider a more general scheme of these sigma and delta families, P sets and Q sets. Let's first define P1 as the family of open sets and Q1 as the family of closed sets. Then we can define P psi and Q psi with this iterative scheme, where P psi is the countable union of sets in Q eta with eta strictly less than psi, and Q psi is the countable intersection of sets in P eta with eta strictly less than psi. It kind of looks like this crisscross pattern here. So we have some simple relations, like P2 is F sigma, Q2 is G delta, and P3 is F sigma delta. But the real draw of these P and Q families is how they relate to Baire class functions. For example, a result we'll use in the present proof is that if Y is a separable arcwise connected metric space and psi is greater than 1, then a function mapping into Y is Baire class psi if and only if it's class P psi plus 1, or if the inverse image of every open set in Y is a set in P psi plus 1. Now I'll rattle off those 5 lemmas real quick. We'll say that 2 sets are equivalent if both of their differences are countable. So you could think of equivalent sets as being almost the same. Lemma 18 says that equivalence still holds under set differences. A non-degenerate interval is an interval with more than one point. So non-empty open intervals, closed intervals with more than one point, and half intervals are all non-degenerate. Lemma 19 says that arbitrary unions of non-degenerate intervals, even uncountable unions, are equivalent to open sets. Lemma 20 says that a non-decreasing function defined on a subset of the real line can be extended to the whole real line so long as its distance from the line y equals x is uniformly bounded. Lemma 21 says that if f is Baire class psi and h is a non-decreasing function, both of which are defined on the real line, then the composition f of h is also Baire class psi off of some countable set. The last lemma, lemma 22, is the important one. It's another sandwich lemma. Remember lemma 15 in the previous section. We said that for a given function phi, if for every open set u in its range, you can sandwich an f sigma set between the inverse image of u and the inverse image of its closure plus a countable set, then phi is f sigma class off of some countable subset. Lemma 22 is similar. For xi greater than 1, if a function phi has the property that for every open set u in its range, you can sandwich a set of class p xi plus 1 between the inverse image of u and the inverse image of its closure, then phi is Baire class xi. Exploiting this property is exactly how we're going to prove that our boundary functions are Baire class. Okay, so remember the theorem we're trying to prove. The boundary function phi for a Baire class xi half-plane function f is Baire class xi plus 1. And to get there, we're going to use the sandwich property from lemma 22. We'll start with an arbitrary open set u and eventually sandwich a p xi plus 2 set between its inverse image under phi and the inverse image of its closure. So let v be the exterior of u, and let a and b be the inverse images of u and v under phi, respectively. Let c be the union of a and b. For each point x in E, the domain of phi, we're going to draw an arc gamma on which f converges to phi such that if x is in A, then the half-plane function f maps gamma x into u, and likewise if x is in B, then f maps gamma x into v. We'll also restrict these arcs to lie in a unit semicircle. So you can imagine these arcs as little hairs coming out of the set E, pubes if you'd like. Continuing with the analogy, now we're going to progressively shave the pubes down and divide E based on how tangled the pubes are. If we're given a point x in A, and no matter how far down we shave, we can always find another point y in E, such that gamma x crosses gamma y, or that the pube at x is tangled with another pube at y, then we say that x belongs to the set L sub A, and we can do something similar to define L sub B. We'll also define a set complementary to this. So if x is in A, and there exists some n such that shaving the pubes down to height 1 over n leaves gamma x disjoint from all the other pubes, then we say that x is in M sub A, and similar for M sub B. So in a sense, you can think of the L sets as being almost like pube-wise limit points, and the M sets as being pube-wise isolated. But it depends on how you select your pubes, right? For instance, if you can comb all of your pubes in a straight line, then none of them cross and all of the x belong to the M sets. But this isn't always possible, which is why we need to account for the L sets as well. Bear with me here, because we're also going to need K sub n sets. We say x is in K sub n if the pube at x reaches height 1 over n, with the added condition that if x is in an M set, then the pube is also isolated at a height of 1 over n. It's easy to imagine as n gets large, these K sets start to cover C. Moreover, they're nested. So remember, just to orient ourselves, we need to fit a p xi plus 2 set between A and B complement. So now we're going to start making descriptive statements about these L and M sets we just made. First, consider the set L sub A union x minus K sub n. So this is going to include points with infinitely tangled pubes and some extra stuff. Ted proves that for every n and every x in one of these sets, we can fit a non-degenerate closed interval in the set which contains x. The proof has a nice visual, so I'm going to go ahead and explain this one. With all the sets we have to deal with, this might sound like alphabet soup, but hopefully the pictures help. Let x be in L sub A. So by definition, for the n we've chosen, there exists some y elsewhere in C with the property that the pubes at x and y intersect, below the height of 1 over n. Furthermore, because they intersect, we must have y in A. We're going to show that the closed interval from x to y is in this L sub A union x minus K sub n set. So let's pick a point T in the interval. If T is not in K sub n, then it's in X minus K sub n and therefore in the set. So that's fine. So let's now assume that T is in K sub n. So now we have to show that T is in L sub A to complete the proof. Because T is in K sub n, it has a pube gamma T that reaches the ceiling 1 over n. And by the picture here, that means that it must intersect either gamma sub x or gamma sub y. There's a rigorous argument behind this which Ted cites, but that's beyond our scope. But remember, by the way that we constructed K sub n, that if T is in M, then its pube must be isolated. So T can't be in M because it crosses one of the other pubes, so it has to be in L. Further, since the pube at T intersects either the pube at X or Y, which both are in A, then T must be in L sub A. And that completes the proof. So in these weird L sub A union X minus K sub n sets, we can fit a non-degenerate closed interval about each point X in the set, and we'll call this interval INX. Let W sub n be the union over X of these chosen intervals. You can imagine that for small n, these W sub n sets are a coarse covering of L sub A, and as n gets large, X minus K sub n starts to approach X minus C, so its intersection with C minus L sub A gets small. In fact, some simple set manipulations show exactly that L sub A is equal to the intersection of C with all of the W sub n. And here's the key step. Since each W sub n is a union of non-degenerate closed intervals, by lemma 19, it's equivalent to an open set. And by extension, the countable intersection of the W sub n is equivalent to a G delta set. We'll call this G sub A. Therefore, we have that L sub A is equivalent to G sub A intersect C. We can repeat these arguments on B to get that L sub B is also equivalent to a G delta set G sub B intersects C. So those were the L sets. Now we have to say something about the M sets. Let's let X be in M intersect K sub n. So the pube at X reaches a height 1 over n and doesn't intersect any other pubes. Let's also define a function H0 sub n on the domain M intersect K sub n, which tracks the X coordinate of where the pube at X touches the line 1 over n. So in this case right here. Then if X prime is greater than X, since the pubes can't touch, we must have that H0 sub n at X prime is greater than H0 sub n at X. This means that H0 sub n is strictly increasing. Moreover, since the pubes are defined to have radius bounded by 1, then the function X minus H0 sub n is necessarily uniformly bounded by 1. So by lemma 20, we can extend H0 sub n to a non-decreasing function H sub n, which is now defined on the entire real line. Now let G sub n of X be equal to f of H sub n X, comma 1 over n, essentially tracking the value of f at the other endpoint of gamma sub n. Since f of X, comma 1 over n is Baire class psi, and since we are composing it with a non-decreasing function H sub n, by lemma 21, we have that G sub n of X is Baire class psi off of some countable subset, say big N. Say big N sub n. Let the countable union of these countable sets be big N. Taking subsets, it's easy to see that G sub n is also Baire class psi on the smaller set M minus big N. Now let's revisit our definition of G sub n. As n gets large, this input point of f, H sub n of X, comma 1 over n, approaches X on the line gamma X. Furthermore, since for all n sufficiently large, the X and M are also going to be in M intersect K sub n, then the pubes at X reach the line Y equals 1 over n. This means that G sub n restricted to M converges to the boundary function phi restricted to M, precisely because we're following the arcs of convergence. This also holds on the restriction to M minus big N, and now since the G sub n are Baire class psi and converge to the boundary function restricted to M minus big N is also Baire class psi plus 1. So this is definitely a step in the right direction. We want to show that the whole boundary function is Baire class psi plus 1, and we've just shown that its restriction to the set M minus big N is Baire class. But remember, we're going to finish the proof instead with the sandwich property by placing a P psi plus 2 set between A and B complement. This is where the P sets start to come in. Because phi restricted to M minus big N is Baire class psi plus 1, then its inverse image of U is P psi plus 2. In the relative topology, this means that we can select a P psi plus 2 set D such that D intersect M minus big N is equal to A intersect M minus big N. But by lemma 18, we can basically throw out this countable set big N and say that D intersect M is equivalent to A intersect M. The rest of the proof is basically a bunch of set manipulations using our earlier insights about L sub A and L sub B that all lead to A being equivalent to S intersect C, where S is in P Xi plus 2. But since countable sets are F sigma, we can pass from equivalence to equality, saying that A is equal to T intersect C, where T is in P Xi plus 2. And by this equation, we must have that T intersect B is empty. Therefore, T is precisely the P Xi plus 2 set we can sandwich between A and B complement. And hitting this with lemma 22 completes the proof. QED, bitch. No doubt about it, this was a tough proof, and one that evaded Fred and George. Remember, they conjectured that the boundary functions were only in Baire class Xi plus 2, which was actually weaker than what Ted proved here. I did kind of dive a little deeper into the weeds on this proof review, so here at the end I'd like to take a step back and recap what we did in more approachable terms. We started with a Baire class Xi half-plane function f, and wanted to prove that its boundary function phi is Baire class Xi plus 1. By the definition of the boundary function, you have all of these arcs on which f converges to values of phi. Now you might think, sequences of Baire functions, obviously you're going to go up one rung on the Baire ladder, right? But these arcs, these hairs, these pubes, they could be pointing in all different directions and be pathologically tangled with one another. So what we did was isolate the untangled pubes, comb them with this H function, and then showed that on this subset of nicely behaved pubes, the convergence to a BC Xi plus 1 function does hold. Then we exploited facts about the tangled pube set, passed through from equality to equivalence in order to make manipulations nicer, and then once we got something close to what we wanted, we passed back from equivalence to equality and finished off the proof with the sandwich lemma. It's debatable whether Ted was conceptualizing this proof in terms of pubic hair, but it's results like these where he bridged a gap that his professors couldn't think of that I think particularly led to the high praise of his thesis. Okay, I'll admit my explanation of this one was a little clunky, but hopefully I can clarify some things here. First of all, we didn't pass from equality to equivalence purely to make the set manipulations nicer. We needed to pass through to equivalence because we had to throw out that countable subset big N so that all of the G sub n are Baire class Xi on M minus big N. This probably would have been a better picture to show, where by lemma 21, each of the G sub n might be Baire class Xi off of their own individual countable subset, big N sub n, but they are all Baire class Xi off of the bigger countable subset, big N, which is the union of all of the big N sub n. So while G sub n restricted to M converges to the boundary function phi restricted to M, it's not necessarily true that the G sub n are Baire class Xi on all of M, which would impede us from concluding that the boundary function is Baire class Xi plus 1 on all of them. So we throw out the countable subset big N to make the Baire class relation work. And then when we're dealing with the P sets, we use equivalence and effectively ignore big N. I think the big question you should be left with after this proof is how is this different from the previous section? We just showed that Baire class Xi half-plane functions have Baire class Xi plus 1 boundary functions, but that this only works for Xi greater than or equal to 1. How come this doesn't work for Baire class 0 functions? Or in other words, why do continuous functions have honorary BC2 boundary functions and not BC1 boundary functions? I mean, the proofs are sort of similar, right? We had to use sandwich lemmas for both, and I didn't expand on this for the second one, but the sandwich lemmas both imply something about how the function handles inverse images of open sets. It all kind of boils down to these two results by Banach that Ted cites at the beginning of his thesis. The first one is nice. It says that Baire class Xi functions mapping into separable metric spaces are class P Xi plus 1. The second is a partial converse, and it's not so nice. This one says that a class P Xi plus 1 function mapping into a separable and also arcwise connected metric space is Baire class Xi only if Xi is not equal to 1. So this discrepancy is basically the reason we don't have uniformity in our boundary function results. I haven't looked into these proofs, so I can't exactly say where the breakdown occurs in them, but if I had to hand-wave my way through an explanation, it's probably because, at least in Euclidean space, functions that take value on countable sets and vanish elsewhere are in Baire class 2. So the fact that with boundary functions for continuous interior functions, we have to make these kind of countable modifications with the honorary Baire class 2 functions kind of lines up with this bifurcation in the results. It's also worth drawing a connection back to Fred's first result on boundary functions. Remember when he proved that boundary functions have at most a countable number of ambiguity points. So suppose we have a half-plane function f with boundary function phi, but phi has a countably infinite number of ambiguity points. If f is Baire class Xi greater than or equal to 1, then phi is Baire class Xi plus 1, which is greater than or equal to 2. And changing values of this function on a countable number of points does not raise its Baire class. In fact, it's even better. Changing values of functions of Baire class 3 or greater on a countable number of points can't decrease their Baire class, or in other words, they can't get any more well-behaved. This was proved by Hans Hahn in 1921 and cited by Fred and George in their 61 paper. On the other hand, if f is continuous and phi is a Baire class 1 boundary function with a countably infinite number of ambiguity points, it could potentially happen that altering the values of phi at the ambiguity points brings phi out of Baire class 1 and into honorary Baire class 2. Anyways, that's another hand-wavy explanation for why you get this discrepancy between boundary functions for continuous half-plane functions and those for more general Baire class half-plane functions. Now we only have one proof left. This is it. This is where the proverbial shit hits the proverbial fan. All of the previous results essentially put a cap on how nasty boundary functions can get. Boundary functions of continuous half-plane functions are honorary Baire class 2, boundary functions of Baire class Xi half-plane functions are Baire class Xi plus 1, and Borel to Borel. It all falls apart here. If your half-plane function is Lebesgue measurable, it's not necessarily true that your boundary function is also Lebesgue measurable. In fact, it's even worse. There are no restrictions on how bad your boundary function can get. It could be fucking anything. And now we're going to show this by construction. We're going to start with an arbitrary boundary function phi and build a half-plane function f that's Lebesgue measurable. Now remember, Lebesgue measure is complete, meaning that all subsets of a null set are also measurable. So the way these things usually go is that if you want to make a measurable function, the easy thing to do is make it constant, except off of a set of measure 0, which is exactly what Ted does. Ted starts out this section talking about trapezoids, but not exactly the ones you learned about in grade school. These trapezoids are pretty fucking weird. So a normal trapezoid might look something like this, right? Maybe its parallel lines are horizontal on y equals 0 and y equals 1. The bottom base is a line segment of length b sub 0, and its top base has length b sub 1. If you wanted to find the area of this thing, you'd use the typical formula, 1/2 times b sub 0 plus b sub 1. You could think of this as similar to calculating the area of a rectangle with height 1 and length as the average of the bases of the trapezoid. You might also conceive of this trapezoid as being the disjoint unions of a bunch of line segments with respective endpoints on the x-axis and the line y equals 1, so something like this. Now, why in the world would we do this? Well, the trapezoids that Ted is going to discuss are precisely these bizarre unions of disjoint lines, but instead of their intersection with top and bottom lines being closed intervals, they could be some arbitrary set, even something non-measurable. So let's say you have a bunch of these disjoint lines and you want to calculate the area of their union. Pretty weird concept, I know, but this is where we actually get to use some measure theory. However, like I said, these lines accumulate in some very bizarre ways, so it might not be suitable for Lebesgue measure. Instead, we're going to use a two-dimensional exterior measure, or an outer measure, defined as the Lebesgue measure of the smallest open set which covers these lines. This way we can define one of these exterior measures on any set, even the weird ones. What Ted proves about this, and it takes him 3 pages to do so, is that this two-dimensional exterior measure of disjoint lines from y equals 0 and y equals 1 actually satisfies something analogous to the trapezoid formula. We find that the two-dimensional exterior measure of the union of lines is equal to the average of one-dimensional exterior measures of the sets where the lines intersect y equals 0 and y equals 1. Importantly for us, if these intersection sets have exterior measure 0, then the union of the lines has two-dimensional exterior measure 0 as well. Further, once we get these sets of exterior measure 0, we can pass through to genuine Lebesgue measure, since Lebesgue measure is complete and all null sets are measurable. We're going to need one more oddball result for this construction, and that's this: the existence of a strictly increasing real-valued function that maps the real line to a set of measure 0, and moreover, its distance from y equals x is uniformly bounded by epsilon. Now, the monotone functions you might be used to, x cubed, e to the x, arctan, these things all map the real line into non-degenerate intervals. So what might a function look like that maps the real line into a set of measure 0? Maybe a step function, right? Its range only occupies a countable set. And if we need this thing to be epsilon close to y equals x, we could make these steps really small. But even this step function doesn't satisfy the properties we need because it's not strictly increasing. At each step, the function's flat. So how can we resolve this? How do we make a function that is both strictly increasing and mapping into a set of measure 0? We're going to use this. Now, what the fuck is this thing? This is a map from the closed interval 0, 1 into a set of measure 0, the Cantor set, in fact. How it works is you take a number in the interval and represent it with a binary decimal. This is the input. We get the output by replacing every 1 in its decimal expansion with a 2 and then treating that as a ternary decimal, or base 3. So for instance, 1/2 maps to 2/3, 2/3 maps to 3/4, etc. The range of this function is base 3 decimals which do not contain a 1 in their expansion, precisely the Cantor middle third set. Moreover, the function is evidently strictly increasing. The one thing that's missing is a bound of epsilon from the function y equals x, but for that we can just paste together scaled copies without issue. Here's where we get to put the pieces together. Remember, we're starting with an arbitrary boundary function phi, and we want to build a measurable half-plane function f with phi as its boundary. And to do this, I hinted that working with measure 0 sets would be advantageous because Lebesgue measure is complete. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to make a collection of paths gamma x, one for each point on the x-axis. You remember the pubes from the last section. Since we want f to have curvilinear convergence to phi, we're going to define f equal to phi of x on the path gamma x. But we're going to construct the paths so that they take up a set of measure 0 on the half plane, forcing f to be measurable. This is where that Cantor type function comes in. Let h sub n be one of these strictly increasing functions mapping the real line into a set of measure 0 with a uniform bound of 1/n from y equals x. Then set s sub n to be the set of line segments from h sub n of x, 1/n to h sub n plus 1 of x, 1/n plus 1. So think that we're filling this horizontal space with a bunch of line segments. Because the h sub n functions are strictly increasing, the lines are disjoint, which means we get to use the trapezoid theorem. And because each of these h functions map the real line into a set of measure 0, it follows that the two-dimensional exterior measure of the union of these line segments is also 0. And since Lebesgue measure is complete, we can assign this union Lebesgue measure 0. Now we're going to construct these line segments for all n. Each of these horizontal slices have measure 0. Moreover, by countable subadditivity of measure, the cumulative total of these sets has measure 0. And so the paths that we want to construct, gamma x, we write as the segmented linear path from h1 of x, 1 to h2 of x, 1/2, and so forth. Because we've constructed h sub n of x to have distance 1/n from x, these segments accumulate to x, 0. So there we go. We have our gamma x paths that occupy a measure 0 set in the half plane and that converge to every point on the x-axis. So we are now free to choose a half plane function f with value phi of x on gamma x for all x and 0 everywhere else. So f is measurable and has phi as a potentially non-measurable boundary function. And we are done. With this argument, Ted proved that measurable half-plane functions don't necessarily have measurable boundary functions. This result in the context of Ted Kaczynski's thesis is perhaps the most unusual. Surely the content of the result is unlike the rest of what we've seen. Everything up to this point places limits on how pathological boundary functions can become. And here, Ted shows that even by restricting half-plane functions to be measurable, the boundary functions can be anything, literally anything. But even the proof of this result is decidedly simpler than the rest. The trapezoid theorem has a somewhat intensive proof, but the rest of it, realistically speaking, is elementary measure theory. Exploit one of these analysis curiosities, work with sets of measure 0 to preserve measurability. The ingredients are not surprising. Even still, this is something that Ted's peers hadn't figured out to that point, and it's an important result to round out the holistic picture of boundary functions. That's it. That's Ted Kaczynski's whole fucking thesis.
You studied math, right? Why? I'm just getting it up. I enjoy it. Really? How interesting. Yeah. Pure mathematics is useless from a practical point of view, and that's what I studied. I mean, a lot of people don't understand what mathematicians really do. You know, they think they sit there adding up columns of figures or something like that. But that's not what it is. It's more like puzzle solving. Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that he gravitated towards math is something he could do in isolation. It's not a team project.
After graduating from University of Michigan in 1967 at the age of 25, Ted Kaczynski accepted an acting assistant professor role at the University of California, Berkeley. At the time, he was the youngest faculty member in the history of the department, and apparently was on track for tenure. Only 2 years later, in 1969, Ted unceremoniously vacated the position to move back home with his parents, and in 71 left for that infamous cabin in Lincoln, Montana, where he would become the Unabomber. That part of the story you've probably heard all about. I'm more interested in that 2-year period from 67 to 69, the last time he would be academically active. Ted's thesis closed with 5 open questions, building off the results he proved. I'll list them here. This first question is probably the most pressing. Ted proved that continuous half-plane functions have honorary Baire class 2 boundary functions, and furthermore their sets of curvilinear convergence are F sigma delta. But he did these two things kind of separately, right? He proved that for a given F sigma delta set, you can construct a continuous half-plane function that has curvilinear convergence precisely on, but the construction dictates that the boundary function is 0. Also, the half-plane function is complex and not real. On the other hand, when he started with an honorary BC2 boundary function defined on a subset E of the x-axis and constructed a corresponding half-plane function, that half-plane function could have curvilinear convergence outside of E. So this first question aims to combine the two. Given an honorary Baire class 2 boundary function defined on a subset A of the x-axis, can we find a corresponding real-valued half-plane function that has A precisely as its set of curvilinear convergence? That's the first question. A similar question first proposed by J.E. McMillan asks if you can do this for functions mapping into the Riemann sphere. As we saw with some of these proofs, the details and mechanisms can change depending on whether these functions map into Euclidean space, metric spaces with separability, arcwise connectedness, etc. The third question aims to extend our understanding of the curvilinear convergence sets. We know that continuous half-plane functions have these F sigma delta convergence sets, but can we say something similar about Borel measurable half-plane functions, or even Baire class half-plane functions? Are those curvilinear convergence sets Borel? Question 4. We know more or less what's going on in the half-plane situation. Does any of this extend to n-dimensional space, or are we just fucking around here? And lastly, question 5, kind of a different question. This asks if we still have something that looks like the trapezoid theorem if we relax the condition that the lines be disjoint. Can we put a lower bound on the two-dimensional measure of lines if we know the measure of these sets on the top and bottom? Weirdly, Ted proves that there isn't an upper bound, briefly constructing a situation where top and bottom sets have measure 0, but its line segment set touches every point in between, thus having infinite measure. Ted claims answering this question would help answer an open question from Fred and George, but sadly I don't have access to the paper that this came from. During his stint at UC Berkeley, Ted would publish 3 more papers on boundary functions, answering questions both from his thesis and from earlier works by his professor George Peranian. In Boundary Functions for Bounded Harmonic Functions, Ted applies his techniques to a more concretely complex analytic setting, demonstrating the existence of a bounded harmonic function on the disk with boundary function not belonging in Baire class 0 or 1. 3 months later, Ted published Boundary Functions and Sets of Curvilinear Convergence for Continuous Functions, where he answered question 2 from his thesis in the affirmative, that if you define an F sigma delta set A on the unit circle and an honorary BC2 function on A mapping into the Riemann sphere, there exists a corresponding complex valued continuous disk function with precisely A as its set of curvilinear convergence. I haven't studied this proof, but perhaps unsurprisingly, it looks like a combination of the 2 component proofs of his thesis. He still leaves question 1 open, the construction of a real-valued continuous interior function with a given curvilinear convergence set and boundary. Ted's last paper on boundary functions is his article, The Set of Curvilinear Convergence of a Continuous Function in a Cube, where he attempts to extend his results to 3 dimensions. Here he demonstrates the existence of a continuous complex valued function in a cube that has curvilinear convergence set that is not Borel measurable. So more or less casting doubt that the conclusions from his thesis carry over to higher dimensions, yet still depending on vector-valued functions and not scalar functions to do so. Ted also dabbled in some more recreational math in the publication Mathematics magazine during this time as well. In 1968, Ted answered a question from Alan Sutcliffe on a digit reversal problem that's actually pretty interesting. I'll review it here for context. In the early 1900s, Hardy made an obscure offhand comment that the only 2 4-digit numbers whose digit reversals are factors of the original number are 9,801 and 8,712. So 1,089 times 9 is 9,801, and 2,178 times 4 is 8,712. Over a half-century later in 1966, Alan Sutcliffe generalized the problem to consider digit reversals of arbitrary base n, and left the following open question. Does there exist an N which admits a 3-digit solution but not a 2-digit solution? In '68, Ted Kaczynski disproved this prospect, or in other words showed that every N which admits a 3-digit solution must also admit a 2-digit solution. In '71, after leaving Berkeley, Ted submitted a problem of his own, a geometric problem about covering a grid with matchsticks in a specific way. The problem was answered by 2 readers later that year. And that was really it for his mathematics career. Despite displaying promise early on, the broader impact of Ted Kaczynski on his peers in the field was disappointingly minimal. While we don't have a complete record of citations of his work, we can draw some conclusions from what exists. Most notably, boundary functions as its own distinct discipline seemed to all but disappear in the 70s after Ted stopped publishing. In '67, L.E. Snyder wrote a quick letter about bi-arc boundary functions, or boundary functions which reached the same limit by at least 2 disjoint arcs. Ted would later cite that paper himself. Ted's most enduring contribution, if you could say that, is his '65 paper on boundary functions for disk functions. The citations clearly taking more of an interest in the complex analysis implications of his paper rather than the boundary functions in isolation. Alexander Eremenko, a mathematics professor at Purdue who cited Ted Kaczynski in some of his own work, would chime in a Stack Exchange thread to remark this.
I am somewhat familiar with the subject of his work. I would not call it brilliant, but qualify it as an average PhD graduating from a good university.
Personally, I think this is a slightly uncharitable view of Ted's thesis. I could not find Alexander's citations of Ted's work myself, but Alexander worked in complex dynamical systems for a while and also published on cluster sets in the past, so that kind of tracks. Aside from these, the most infamous citation comes from a 2010 paper from Lara Pudwell about the digit reversal problem. She cites Ted's answer to Alan Sutcliffe's problem, but in the footnote she writes, better known for his other work. Jesus fucking Christ, man. Ted's contemporaries moved on with their careers and started asking different flavors of questions about boundary sets. In 1973, Macmillan and Peranian published Compression and Expansion of Boundary Sets, discussing how the measure of curvilinear convergent sets changes under boundary function mapping. Both authors seemed to explore other general analysis topics after. Fred continued to publish on cluster sets and ambiguous points into the 70s, but his paper trail falls off after that. For all intents and purposes, Ted Kaczynski was a mathematical ghost after he left Berkeley, a bizarre lonely figure in the department who conspicuously fled from a budding career, leaving behind phantom traces of his esoteric output, only to be resurrected a quarter-century later upon his arrest, remembered for his equal brilliance and unsettling social demeanor. While Ted left academia suddenly and to his co-workers ostensibly without reason, in his post-arrest interviews, Ted reflected extremely cynically on his experience in pure mathematics, his perspective noticeably filtered through the politics of his manifesto. Here are 2 of his quotes.
Meanwhile, I was doing well in mathematics. It was fun to solve mathematical problems, but in a deeper sense mathematics was boring and empty because for me it had no purpose. If I had worked on applied mathematics I would have contributed to the development of the technological society that I hated. So I worked only on pure mathematics. But pure mathematics was only a game. I did not understand then, and I still do not understand, why mathematicians are content to fritter away their whole lives in a mere game. I myself was completely dissatisfied with such a life. Apart from the most elementary mathematics, like arithmetic or high school algebra, the symbols, formulas and words of mathematics have no meaning at all. The entire structure of pure mathematics is a monstrous swindle, simply a game. A prank. You may well ask, are there no renegades to reveal the truth? Yes, of course, but the facts are so incredible that no one takes them seriously. So the secret is in no danger.
There you go. That was a deep dive into the short-lived mathematical legacy of Theodore John Kaczynski. This is a topic I've been interested in researching for quite some time, and I think it's an important one. Ted isn't the only evil person with a mathematics background. You have other murderers like Andre Bloch, Nazis like Techmuller, but certainly in America, the specter of Ted Kaczynski still looms over college mathematics departments, because regrettably, he's easily one of the top 10 most famous mathematicians of the last 50 years. And yet, a thorough description of his research has been inaccessible that whole time. Mathematicians in a professional setting don't want to spend their time reviewing the, at this point, ancient works of an eventual domestic terrorist, and they'll content themselves with brushing off the whole thing. You know, no one studies boundary functions anymore. His papers had barely any citations. His brilliance was probably overstated. Meanwhile, in the absence of any meaningful insight into his mathematics career, neo-disciples of Kaczynski's anti-text schema are free to embellish Ted's genius, mostly because they don't have the expertise to take a more nuanced view. So what happens is you get the whispers, the anecdotes. Ted had an IQ of 168. Ted was so brilliant he outsmarted his professors. Ted was one of the youngest math professors ever. So all of his carefully constructed half-plane functions, his vision for conceptualizing F sigma delta sets, his understanding of the vital role of honorary Baire class 2 and boundary functions, it all gets reduced to a bullet point in the Ted Kaczynski mythos. Ted was smart guy. Worse yet, the fact that Ted was smart guy is used as a subtextual backdrop for accepting the more morally odious conclusions from his manifesto. I believe this leads to an unfortunate inconsistency. In the context of industrial society and its future, enough people by this point do the best they can to divorce Ted Kaczynski's atrocities from their assessment of his philosophy. Yet, Ted Kaczynski's brilliance, as documented by his Harvard education and mathematical exploits, is taken entirely at face value. It's a disservice to the curious undergrad math majors, to the true crime researchers, and even to the people susceptible to being roped into Kaczynski-inspired right-wing cells, for Ted Kaczynski's mathematics career to be just another shadowy, unsourceable fact of life. What I hope I accomplish with this video is to provide a detailed accounting of Ted's mathematics career, the results of his 1967 thesis, and the unique insights he required to prove those results. To this point, I've strayed away from making holistic judgments of Ted's work in the field, mostly because I feel unqualified even after poring over his thesis. There's a lot of historical context I'm probably missing, and I'm not all that plugged into the modern analysis world to appreciate how his field of study fits into the landscape today. However, I still think it's valuable to share my perspective, because the only other people who have read his thesis line by line like I have are probably all dead. There's no doubt about it, Ted was a fucking smart cookie. That much should be substantiated by his academic credentials. But specifically in the context of his thesis, Ted's ability to use the tools of mathematical analysis and measure theory to draw conclusions that his professors couldn't is undeniably impressive. Going into the thesis, this was the question I really wanted to answer. How did Ted in his early 20s manage to tread mathematical ground that his professors didn't or couldn't? I think the answer has to be that Ted had the patience to articulate these beastly constructions to get his results. The flavor of results from Fred, George, Macmillan, they were deductive, clean, quite abstract. I mean, you look at Fred and George's 1961 paper on boundary functions, the proofs are a page at most. Even though Ted went way unnecessarily overboard to prove that honorary Baire class 2 boundary functions pass through to continuous functions, for example, taking 8 pages to do something Fred and George did in half a page, that same comfort in the weeds and thorns allowed Ted to tread mathematical ground that Fred and George either didn't have time for or weren't able to. Fred and George weren't doing the 24-page special family, special function construction that Ted did, meticulously working case by case to ensure that intersections of special families are still special families. I also don't say this as a backhanded compliment to diminish the inventiveness of Ted's approach either. Like, it takes vision to conceive of the intuition behind some of these proofs, and even more skill to translate that intuition into rigorous mathematics. One thing I could say to knock Ted's efforts down a peg is that the tools he's using are, if not rudimentary, at least standard analysis fodder. And there's not much that Ted's doing in his thesis that's surprising or extraordinarily clever. But that said, these boundary function proofs don't really call for the insights of a generational genius. Rather, they usually require some seemingly mundane observations about the real numbers or real valued functions that have deceptively annoying-ass proofs, then piecing that together with carefully curated set theoretic arguments. And that's exactly what Ted brought to the table. Those are the nice things I can say about Ted's math career. Now for some not nice things. The biggest strike against Ted is that his career was too damn short. If we're drafting people for a fantasy math league or ranking historical mathematicians, part of that assessment has to include the breadth of their publications and the impact of their work. Ted just wasn't around long enough to score high marks in either. Ted only published 10 pieces in his lifetime, 4 of which were minuscule recreational math journal submissions, while the other 6 all discussed boundary functions, a field which, like I said, basically disappeared after he stopped publishing. Personally, I think it's a mistake to use citation count alone to judge a career as short as Ted's, much less use it to value his abilities, but it should be taken into consideration. Maybe the lack of citations was from poor socialization of his results, or just a poor read on Ted's part of what the community would be interested in. It seems like he kind of put all his eggs in the boundary function basket, and it just didn't pan out. Now, in researching this topic, which is understandably difficult to penetrate for the mathematically uninitiated, I've come across a few misinterpretations that I think are worth correcting. Like I said, if you're researching this topic for yourself and you want to place stock in someone's opinion, please choose Ted's professors over me. When Ted's advisor Alan Shields claims that Ted's thesis was the best he's ever directed, I'd go ahead and believe that. But on the other hand, I've seen some quotes from his professors get horribly misconstrued. One of these is from Maxwell Reed, who said,
"I would guess maybe 10 or 12 men in the country understood or appreciated it."
This is almost surely not a statement on the bewildering complexity of the mathematics. I think a first or second year grad student with measure theory experience would be able to make it through just fine. I think more so it's a comment on just how niche and insular the field of boundary functions actually was. I mean, fuck, of that group of 10 to 12 people read references, I've probably named half of them in this video. This to say that I'd sooner use any of the other beaming quotes from his professors to gauge Ted's brilliance than this one. Another claim I see get thrown around quite a bit is that Ted Kaczynski was an expert in complex analysis, or geometric function theory. In fact, the Wikipedia article says it right here. Both of these I would classify as mischaracterizations, the latter of which is more egregious. Ted's publication history really only consists of two things: recreational math puzzles and boundary functions. Now, boundary functions itself, I'll concede, is a distant relative of complex analysis. The lineage goes complex analysis, cluster set theory, then boundary functions. And certainly his professor George Peranian could reasonably be described as a complex analyst. But by the time Ted started writing about boundary functions, there were hardly any vestiges of complex analysis in his work. Even in his 1965 paper on boundary functions on a disk, which you would think has to do with complex analysis, really only uses the unit disk setting out of conventions. His results carry over to the upper half plane with no issue. The only time Ted truly used tools from complex analysis was in his 69 paper on boundary functions of bounded harmonic functions, where some concepts you might expect, like Poisson integrals, make an appearance. But on the whole, this paper again really has less to do with complex analysis and fits in better with Ted's boundary function research catalog. If I were to put a label on Ted's body of work, I think just analysis would suffice. As for geometric function theory, I can't really imagine how someone who read Ted's papers could think his work falls into that category. There's no geometry here at all. No mention of manifolds, Riemann mapping theorem, conformal mappings. I mean, maybe if you squint hard enough, you could think of defining a boundary function as like a version of analytic continuation, but that's really a stretch. The closest relation that Ted has to geometric function theory is that 73 paper from Peranian and Macmillan, which discusses expansion and contraction of boundary sets. It's weird though, someone had to edit the Wikipedia article to say this, right? Well, I found who did. The geometric function line was added on November 23, 2004 by a guy named Greg Kuperberg. Greg is also a mathematician and a prolific one. I'm pretty sure I've seen some of his knot theory work cited in the topological quantum computing literature. And ironically, he received his PhD from UC Berkeley in '91. I had some theories about where Greg got geometric function theory from, that perhaps he heard it from one of his old professors after Ted's arrest, and maybe that professor didn't have the best idea of what Ted actually studied since Ted hardly talked to anyone else in the department. So I got in touch with Greg and asked him about it. Probably unsurprisingly, Greg didn't exactly remember making this edit 18 years ago, but he agreed with my prognosis that Ted's papers were more in line with pure analysis or even topology, although he offered that perhaps questions answered in the boundary function literature were inspired by geometric function theory. And if not that, we at least know that these questions came from a complex analysis lineage. Greg also debunked my theory, insisting that he was many years removed from Berkeley at the time of Ted's arrest and probably didn't talk to any of his old contacts about it. The geometric function theory line wasn't the only edit he added. Greg made large contributions to the Ted Kaczynski article in its embryonic stage in 2004, so in all likelihood, he probably just took a cursory glance of Ted's papers and added GFT because, I mean, boundaries, functions, why not? I bring this story up because it highlights just how many facts we take for granted. Just because a passing mathematician assumed Ted Kaczynski studied geometric function theory, that nugget stayed in the Wikipedia article unchallenged for 18 years and has been perpetuated in basically every context that Ted's math career has been brought up since. I'll get around to editing the page myself later. But probably the worst interpretation I routinely come across is people attempting to draw a link between Ted's mathematics experience and his crime spree decades later. That maybe somehow he logicked his way into justifying mass murder, that he crossed this magical bifurcation between genius and crazy.
When you're that smart, you're already kind of tripping, because regular people don't seem like the same thing as you do.
Right. These are terrible takes that unfortunately are embedded by media and popular culture. Higher level mathematics is so inscrutable to the general populace that there's comfort in the completely unrelatable archetypes. The child prodigy, the genius with no social skills, the mad scientist, the mathematical wizard teetering on paranoid schizophrenia, that last category the American media was happy to present Kaczynski as. But that's not the reality of mathematics. The reality is that mathematicians are people too, and most are pretty normal. I mean, sure, there's been several high-profile eccentric mathematicians, like Paul Erdos, who would basically couch surf at unsuspecting colleagues' houses to do math. Grigory Perelman, who after solving the Poincare conjecture declined the $1 million prize and now just chills in St. Petersburg with his mom out of the public eye. Any math department will have its fair share of social ineptitude or otherwise oddball behavior. My office mate in grad school would ride his unicycle to class every day. Dude, was a trip. But on the whole, mathematicians are just as normal as any other STEM professionals. They're just studying stuff you don't know anything about. Even the elite mathematical minds of the bunch, chances are you wouldn't be able to pick them out of a crowd from surface level interactions. Say you don't believe me though, and we play along pretending that studying math at a high level correlates with emergent social morbidities. You'd have to reconcile the fact that Ted Kaczynski is basically the only one to become a domestic terrorist. But most of all, if you still subscribe to the Kanye West logic of name one genius that ain't crazy, Ted Kaczynski probably isn't the genius you're looking for. I know people wet themselves over IQ numbers. How people still blind to IQ as a valid metric of intelligence in the current year is beyond me. But going by Ted's mathematical output, I personally don't think it's evidence of some otherworldly intellect. Ted's advisor said his PhD was the best he's ever directed. George Peranian called him brilliant. Everyone who interacted with him in a professional capacity had nothing but praise for his abilities. That's all true. But how does his accumulated boundary function literature compare to writings from the seminal giants of mathematics like Ramanujan, Gauss, or Euler, or the hordes of other brilliant mathematicians throughout history? It really doesn't. Like I said, Ted's strength as a mathematician wasn't a result of extraordinary insight. Based on his writings, Ted was patient, meticulous, thorough. So are a lot of other PhD candidates. I don't like drawing connections where there aren't any. That's a hard thing to do when the political subtext is so deafening, but it's the responsible thing. By and large, Ted's math career was one part of his life, his murder spree was another. There's no documented evidence that one led to the other. Sure, you could draw superficial links between Ted's thesis and the presentation of his manifesto, his idiosyncratic attention to detail and his proofs with the meticulous construction of the bombs, but beyond that, math didn't make the Unabomber. If I had to speculate though, if I had to reach beyond the cold austerity of typewritten mathematics to glean something human about Ted Kaczynski, the one thing that strikes me over and over again is this overwhelming sense of isolation and loneliness. If you've read the accounts, that's nothing new. Ted has always been described as quiet and withdrawn, even since his childhood in Illinois. He entered Harvard as a young 16-year-old boy without a driver's license and had difficulty assimilating with his older peers. As a professor at UC Berkeley, his students regarded him as an incompetent teacher, his colleagues barely knew him. The chairman of the department, John W. Addison Jr., called him, quote, almost pathologically shy. Remember the clip I played at the beginning of this chapter?
I think one of the reasons that he gravitated towards math is something he could do in isolation. It's not a team project.
Mathematics may not have been a team project for Ted, but for most people, mathematics absolutely is a team effort. Ted may have at least partially enjoyed the monastic aspects of toiling away in his abstract cubbyhole of a field uncontaminated by the evils of industrial society, but most mathematicians do not operate like this. They're attending seminars, teaching, corresponding with authors, furiously scribbling at the chalkboard trying to explain their ideas to their bewildered colleagues, kind of like that Charlie Day meme. The social interactions, the uptake of new ideas, the questions people ask you about your own ideas, those are the sparks that lead to progress. Perhaps Ted already had one foot out the door when he was at Berkeley, only saving up enough money to buy his cabin in Montana, but his antisocial disposition would have been a detriment had he stuck around. And the irony is that at Michigan, he was surrounded by professors who reveled in the communal aspects of mathematics. Peter Duran said this about Ted's advisor, Alan Shields.
Doing mathematics with Alan was fun. He was creative and powerful, yet childlike in his enthusiasm. His lectures were models of clarity and inspiration. He was a wonderfully gregarious mathematician who found excitement in mathematical discussions with colleagues and students. Throughout his career, he always had a strong tendency to collaborate. The record shows that of his 80 research papers, all but 15 were written jointly with other mathematicians. He had 44 different co-authors.
George Peranian was like the beating heart of Michigan mathematics, founding and leading the Michigan Mathematics Journal to showcase the work of others. Meanwhile, Ted never had a co-author, never peeked out from the safety of boundary functions, never truly tapped into the broader complex analysis community that he would have had unparalleled access to at Michigan or even at Berkeley. And so Ted cynically assessing all of pure mathematics as just a useless game starts to make sense, because the way that Ted worked, it may as well have been. So in conclusion, Ted was a smart guy. He wrote a good thesis. If he kept working and explored outside his tiny niche of boundary functions, maybe he could have proved some remarkable things. Maybe he wouldn't have. We'll never know. But one thing is for sure, Ted doesn't miss the world of mathematics. And at the end of the day, mathematics won't miss Ted Kaczynski either.